You think you know how this story ends. You think you understand prophecy, fate, and the inevitable collapse of empires. But what if I told you the woman who saw her own death still chose to save her killer? What if the boy destined to burn kingdoms did it all for love? Stay with me until the end. Because this isn't just another tale of power and betrayal. This is about the moment when mercy becomes chains, when protection becomes poison, and when the person you save becomes the one thing you cannot survive. Let me show you how empires fall. The winter riots started 3 weeks before Serafina Vale saw her own murder. She stood on the palace balcony overlooking the Capitol Square where protesters hurled stones at the Imperial Guard. Smoke billowed from burning merchant stalls. The air tasted like ash and blood. Below, soldiers beat back waves of starving citizens with shields and clubs, but the crowd kept surging forward like a living wound refusing to close. Serafina pulled her cloak tighter. The cold bit through expensive fabric, through skin, straight into bone. She had learned long ago that weather was the least dangerous thing that could destroy you. It was the warm things that killed. Trust, hope, the belief that tomorrow would be kinder than today. She closed her eyes and the vision slammed into her skull like a blade. Silver eyes, a young man's face twisted in anguish, her own reflection in polished steel as it punched through her ribs. The sensation of her heart stopping, one final beat, then silence. She gasped and opened her eyes. The square swam back into focus. The riot continued. Nothing had changed except now she knew exactly how she would die. The palace steward appeared at her elbow, a nervous man with ink-stained fingers who always smelled faintly of old parchment. Lord Merrick, the Emperor's bastard nephew. What does he want? The steward cleared his throat. The Emperor requests your presence in the judgment hall, Your Grace. There are executions scheduled, political prisoners from the uprising. Serafina's jaw tightened. She hated these displays. The Empire believed fear kept order, but fear only taught people to hate quietly and strike harder when the moment came. Tell His Majesty I'll attend. The steward bowed and vanished. Serafina remained on the balcony a moment longer, watching soldiers drag a bloodied man toward the prison carts. The crowd screamed, some in rage, some in grief. She wondered which emotion would outlast the other. Neither, she decided. Rage and grief were siblings. They fed each other until there was nothing left but ash. The judgment hall stank of unwashed bodies and terror. Serafina entered through the rear gallery, where nobles gathered to watch justice performed like theater. She recognized most of them, soft-handed lords who had never held a weapon, ladies who treated execution days like social events, merchants who calculated profit margins while men died. The emperor sat on an elevated throne at the hall's center, draped in crimson and gold that made him look like an aging dragon pretending to be relevant. Emperor Valin Mordaunt was 63 years old and had ruled through 2 famines, 1 civil war, and countless assassinations. He survived by being more ruthless than anyone willing to challenge him. He saw Serafina and smiled, the expression warm as a knife in winter. Duchess Vale, how generous of you to join us. I thought perhaps the cold had driven you back to your southern estates. Serafina descended the stairs, her boots clicking on marble. I go where duty calls, Your Majesty. Valin's smile widened. Of course you do. That's what makes you such a treasure. Loyal to the very end. She heard the threat beneath the compliment. Valin kept his allies close and terrified. Love and fear looked identical from the right angle. The first prisoner was brought forward, a blacksmith who had supposedly stolen grain from imperial stores to feed his family. The man couldn't have been older than 30, but hard labor had aged him into something breakable. He didn't beg. He stared at the floor while the charges were read. Valin waved his hand. Execute him. The axe fell. Blood pooled on stone. The nobles applauded politely. Serafina felt nothing. She had learned to bury emotion so deep it couldn't surface during moments like this. Feeling was luxury. Feeling got you killed. 3 more prisoners followed. A teacher, a baker, a farmer's daughter who had painted protest slogans on the magistrate's wall. All dead within minutes. Then they brought out the boy. He couldn't have been older than 12. Thin as a winter branch, covered in bruises and filth, with wild black hair that hung over his face. Chains rattled as guards shoved him forward. He didn't stumble, didn't cry, just stood there with his head down, shoulders rigid with the kind of stillness that comes from knowing. Struggling only makes pain last longer. The magistrate read the charges. Sedition, arson, conspiracy to murder imperial officials. A child, Serafina thought. They're executing a child. She opened her mouth to speak, then stopped. Intervening would draw Valen's attention. Make her a target. The smart move was to stay silent and let the boy die with the others. But then the boy raised his head. Silver eyes. Serafina's breath caught. It was him. The face from her vision. The boy who would one day stand over her corpse with blood on his hands. The Emperor leaned forward, amused. What crime did this little animal commit? The magistrate shuffled papers. He set fire to a tax collector's office, Your Majesty. 3 men died in the blaze. Valen laughed, a sound like breaking glass. A child terrorist, how delightfully modern. Kill him. The executioner moved forward, axe already slick with blood from earlier deaths. Serafina didn't think. She stepped down from the gallery onto the judgment floor, her voice cutting through the hall. Wait. Every eye turned toward her. Valen's smile vanished. Duchess Vale. You have something to say? Serafina walked toward the boy, forcing her expression into something calm and calculated. She could feel her pulse hammering but kept her hand steady. I request custody of this prisoner. The hall went silent. Valen tilted his head. Custody. You want to adopt a murderous orphan? Serafina met his gaze without flinching. He's a child who acted out of desperation. House Vale has resources for rehabilitation. I'll take full responsibility for his actions. Why? Because executing children creates martyrs, Your Majesty. The people already riot in the streets. Do you want to give them another reason to burn your empire? It was the right argument. Valen cared about control above all else, and Serafina had just offered him a way to appear merciful while maintaining power. Valen studied her for a long moment, then waved his hand dismissively. Fine. Take your little project. But if he commits another crime, you'll both hang beside him. Serafina bowed. Understood, Your Majesty. Guards unlocked the boy's chains. He swayed slightly, unsteady on his feet. Up close, Serafina could see the full extent of his injuries. Split lip, blackened eye, ribs visible through torn clothing. Someone had beaten him recently and thoroughly. She wanted to feel triumph at saving a life. Instead, all she felt was the cold certainty of her vision. This boy will kill me, but not today. The carriage ride back to Vale Manor was silent, except for the rattle of wheels on cobblestone. Serafina sat across from the boy, studying him in the dim light filtering through curtained windows. He hadn't spoken since leaving the palace, just stared at his hands, which were raw and blistered from labor. Do you have a name? Serafina asked. No response. I'm Duchess Serafina Vale. You're going to live at my estate now. Do you understand? The boy's fingers curled into fists. His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse and wrecked. Why? Why what? Why save me? Serafina leaned back against the seat, considering the question. Because you're a child. So were the others. The statement landed like a punch. Serafina felt something twist in her chest, an emotion she couldn't quite name. Guilt, maybe? Or recognition of a truth she'd been avoiding. You're right, she said quietly. They were. And I let them die. Then why am I different? Serafina looked at him directly, this broken boy who would someday destroy her. I don't know yet. The boy's silver eyes lifted, meeting hers for the first time. Something passed between them in that moment. Not trust, not gratitude, just acknowledgement. Two people staring across a chasm neither could cross. The carriage turned onto the manor's private road, iron gates closing behind them with a sound like a cell door locking. Vale Manor sat on the northern edge of the capital, surrounded by high walls and older magic. The estate had belonged to Serafina's family for 6 generations, built back when duchesses still led armies and nobility, meant something other than elaborate costumes and empty titles. The staff met them at the entrance. Maurice, the head housekeeper, whose stern face had terrified Serafina as a child. Corvin, the aging steward who managed the estate's finances, and a handful of younger servants who stared at the filthy boy with barely concealed horror. Maris took one look at him and pursed her lips. What is that? A guest, Serafina said firmly. Prepare the East Wing quarters, draw a bath, find appropriate clothing. Your Grace, Maris began with respect. We don't know what diseases he might carry, what vermin. Now, Maris? The housekeeper's mouth snapped shut. She grabbed a young maid by the elbow and disappeared into the manor, muttering about propriety and common sense. Corvin approached more carefully, his expression concerned. Your Grace, the household is already stretched managing the winter shortages. Adding another mouth to feed, especially one with a criminal record. He's a child, not a budget problem, Serafina interrupted. Make it work. Corvin bowed stiffly and retreated. Serafina turned to the boy who stood in the entrance hall looking small and feral and utterly lost. Come with me. She led him through corridors lined with family portraits, dead ancestors glaring from gilt frames, each one a reminder of duty and legacy, and the weight of names that outlived bodies. The boy's bare feet left bloody prints on polished marble. They reached the east wing, a section of the manor rarely used since Serafina's parents died. The rooms were furnished but covered in dust sheets, forgotten spaces where ghosts lived more comfortably than people. Maris had already started a bath in the adjoining washroom. Steam curled through the doorway, carrying the scent of lavender and soap. Serafina gestured toward it. Clean yourself, there's clothing on the bed. When you're finished, someone will bring food. The boy didn't move. Serafina waited. Finally, she knelt, bringing herself to his eye level. I know you don't trust me. I wouldn't either, but you're safe here. No one will hurt you. Do you understand? His silver eyes searched her face, looking for lies. Whatever he found made him nod, just once. Good. Serafina stood and left, closing the door behind her. She leaned against the wall in the corridor, suddenly exhausted. Her hands were shaking. What have I done? She had saved the boy who would kill her, brought him into her home, fed him, protected him. Every strategic instinct screamed this was suicide. But when she closed her eyes, she didn't see her own death. She saw the boy's face in the judgment hall, the hollow emptiness in his silver eyes, the way he hadn't begged or cried because he'd already accepted he was going to die. No child should look like that, even if that child grows into a monster. 3 days passed before the boy spoke again. Serafina had given him space, checking only to ensure he was eating and hadn't tried to escape. Maris reported he stayed in his room, barely touched the food, and flinched whenever anyone approached. On the 4th morning, Serafina found him in the manor's library. He sat on the floor beneath a window surrounded by scattered books. Winter light poured through glass, turning his dark hair almost blue. He held a volume on military history, fingers tracing text he clearly couldn't read. Serafina entered quietly. You like books? The boy's head snapped up. For a moment she thought he might bolt. Then his shoulders relaxed slightly. I can't read. Would you like to learn? Silence. Serafina crossed the room and sat in a nearby chair, careful to keep distance between them. When I was your age, my father locked me in this library for hours every day. Said knowledge was the only inheritance that couldn't be stolen. I hated it then. Now it's my favorite room in the manor. The boy set the book down carefully. Why are you being kind to me? Because I'm not sure what else to be. I killed people. I know. Doesn't that bother you? Serafina considered the question. What bothers me is that a child was pushed so far, he thought arson was his only option. What bothers me is that nobody intervened before you reached that point. What bothers me is that the Empire would rather execute children than fix the system that destroys them. The boy stared at her. You talk strange. Honestly? Yeah. Serafina smiled despite herself. What's your name? Your real name? The boy looked down at his hands. Kael Arden. It's good to meet you properly, Kael. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite trust, but the beginning of something that might someday become it. Winter deepened. Serafina hired a tutor, a patient woman named Ilara, who had once taught noble children before falling out of favor with the imperial court. She worked with Kael 3 hours each morning, teaching letters and numbers while Serafina managed estate business. Progress was slow. Kael had spent most of his life surviving, not learning, but he was smart, frighteningly so. Within weeks, he could read simple texts. Within 2 months, he was devouring books faster than Ilara could assign them. But he never spoke to anyone except Serafina. The staff whispered about the silent shadow that followed the Duchess through corridors. They said he had demon eyes, that he stared at people like he was calculating how to kill them, That sometimes, late at night, he could be heard crying in languages nobody recognized. Serafina ignored the gossip. She had spent her entire life being whispered about. Unmarried at 32, no heirs, too independent, too strange, too much. Let them talk. But she couldn't ignore the visions. They came more frequently now. Always the same scene. Kael standing over her body, silver eyes filled with something that looked like grief. Each time she tried to see more details, find some clue about how to prevent it. But prophecy didn't work that way. The future was a locked door, and looking through the keyhole only showed you what you weren't supposed to see. One night, she woke from the vision screaming. Maris found her sitting upright in bed, drenched in sweat. The housekeeper brought warm tea and sat on the edge of the mattress, like she used to when Serafina was a child having nightmares about her mother's death. Bad dreams, Your Grace? Serafina wrapped her hands around the cup, letting heat sink into her palms. Something like that. Maris hesitated, then spoke carefully. You should send him away. Who? The boy. Kael. He's dangerous, Your Grace. I see it in his eyes. Whatever you think you're saving him from, it's already too late. He's just a child, Maris. No, the housekeeper said quietly. He's something else, and keeping him here will destroy you. Serafina wanted to argue, but Maris had been with House Vale for 40 years. She had helped raise Serafina after the old Duchess died. If anyone had earned the right to brutal honesty, it was her. I know, Serafina admitted, but I can't let him go. Why not? Because if I do, who will he become? Maris stood, smoothing her apron. The same monster he'll become here. Only you won't be alive to regret it. She left, taking the tea tray with her. Serafina sat alone in the dark, wondering if Maris was right. If saving Kael was just elaborate suicide. If prophecy could be cheated, or if trying only made it worse. She didn't have answers. She only had the boy sleeping 3 doors down the hall, and the certain knowledge that one day he would kill her for reasons she couldn't yet understand. Spring arrived like a promise the world couldn't keep. Snow melted into mud, flowers pushed through frozen ground. The capital's riot damage slowly repaired itself, though the scars remained visible. Burned buildings, mass graves, new laws forbidding public assembly. Kael turned 13 in March, though he didn't know his exact birth date. Serafina threw a small celebration, just the household staff and Alara. But Kael spent most of it sitting in the corner looking confused about why anyone would commemorate his existence. Afterward, Serafina found him in the library. You didn't enjoy your birthday. It wasn't a question. Kael shrugged, tracing patterns on the window glass. I never had one before. That's why I wanted you to have one now. He turned to look at her, silver eyes searching. Why do you care so much? Serafina sat in her usual chair. Because someone should. But why you? Why risk everything for me? I'm nobody. I'm nothing. I'm just... You're not nothing, Serafina interrupted. You're brilliant and damaged and angry, and that's normal given everything you've survived. But you're not nothing. Kael's hands curled into fists. You don't know what I am. Then tell me. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Kael spoke, his voice barely above whisper. The night I burned that building, I watched the men die. Heard them screaming, smelled their skin burning, and I felt nothing, just empty, like part of me was already dead. He looked at her directly. What if that's all I am? What if there's nothing else inside me? Serafina felt something break in her chest. She crossed the room and knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. They were cold and trembling. Then we'll find something else, she said firmly. Together, even if it takes the rest of our lives. Kael's eyes filled with tears he refused to let fall. Why? Because you saved me too, Serafina admitted. You just don't know it yet. It was the truth. Before Kael, Serafina had been sleepwalking through existence, going through motions, playing her role as Duchess while feeling nothing. He had given her purpose again, something to protect, someone to fight for, even if that someone would eventually destroy her. Kael pulled his hands free and wiped his eyes roughly. I don't understand you. Good, Serafina said, standing. Understanding is overrated anyway. She left him in the library, surrounded by books and spring light, looking slightly less broken than when she'd found him. Summer brought two problems: an imperial summons and unwanted visitors. The summons arrived first, delivered by a messenger in crimson livery. Emperor Valen requested Seraphina's presence at court for the annual Founders' Banquet, a grotesque display of wealth, while citizens starved in the streets. Attendance was mandatory for all noble houses. Seraphina read the summons 3 times, searching for hidden threats. Valen always had secondary motives. Nothing he did was simple. Corvin appeared in her study doorway. "Your Grace, Lord Theron Blackmore is here to see you." Seraphina's jaw tightened. Blackmore was Valen's attack dog, a minor noble who had risen through backstabbing and strategic cruelty. If he was here, the Emperor wanted something. "Show him to the receiving hall." Theron Blackmore entered like he owned the manor, tall, handsome in a predatory way, wearing expensive clothes that couldn't quite hide the violence underneath. He smiled when he saw Seraphina, the expression all teeth and no warmth. "Duchess Vale." "You look radiant as always." Seraphina remained seated, a subtle power move. "Lord Blackmore, what brings you to my estate? Just a friendly visit?" "The Emperor wanted me to ensure you received his invitation." "I did." "Thank you." Blackmore's eyes traveled around the room, lingering on details. "You've been rather isolated lately. Rumors suggest you're harboring someone unusual." Seraphina's expression didn't change. "I don't pay attention to rumors." "No?" Blackmore stepped closer. "The Empire has been watching you, Duchess. Your little charity project from the winter executions. The boy with the demon eyes. People are curious. He's a child under my guardianship. Nothing more." Blackmore laughed. "Of course. Although I wonder what House Vale's allies think about you raising a terrorist. Optics matter, especially for unmarried women of your status." There it was, the threat wrapped in false concern. Seraphina stood slowly. "My status is secure, Lord Blackmore, and my personal business is exactly that." "Personal, is it?" Blackmore's smile faded. "Because the Emperor believes otherwise. He thinks you're accumulating dangerous loyalties, protecting criminals, challenging imperial authority. Then the Emperor misunderstands my intentions." "Does he?" Blackmore moved closer, invading her space. "Or perhaps you're the one who misunderstands. You're playing a game you can't win, Duchess. The boy you saved will destroy you. Everyone sees it except you." Seraphina met his gaze without flinching. "Get out of my home." Blackmore's hand moved to his sword hilt. "I don't think you understand your position." The library door exploded open. Kael stood in the doorway, and for a moment Seraphina saw exactly what everyone else saw, something feral and dangerous, silver eyes burning with focused rage, hands clenched into fists. "Touch her," Kael said quietly, "and I'll kill you." The temperature in the room dropped. Blackmore turned, assessing the threat. His hand stayed on his sword. "You must be the famous monster." Kael took a step forward. "Leave." Blackmore looked between them, calculation flickering across his features. Then he laughed and stepped back. "Fascinating. The boy actually thinks he can protect you." "He can," Seraphina said coldly. "And he will. Now leave before I have you removed." Blackmore bowed mockingly. "Until the banquet, Duchess. I look forward to seeing how this story ends." He left, boots echoing on marble. Kael remained frozen until the front door closed. Then his shoulders sagged and the dangerous intensity drained away, leaving just a frightened boy who had tried to be brave. Seraphina crossed to him. "Are you all right?" He looked at his hands like they belonged to someone else. "I wanted to hurt him, really hurt him." "I know. Is that wrong?" Seraphina chose her words carefully. "It's human. He threatened something you care about. That's normal. But you said violence wasn't the answer." "It's not. But feeling the impulse doesn't make you a monster. Acting on it without reason does." Kael's eyes lifted to hers. "What if I can't always control it? Then we'll figure that out together." He nodded slowly, but Seraphina saw the doubt in his expression, the fear that he was exactly what everyone said. A weapon, a disaster waiting to happen. She pulled him into a hug, feeling him stiffen before gradually relaxing against her. They stood like that for a long time, while outside the manor walls, an empire slowly turned its attention toward a duchess who had chosen the wrong boy to save. The founder's banquet was exactly as terrible as Serafina expected. She arrived at the imperial palace wearing midnight blue silk and the Vale family diamonds, armor disguised as fashion. Kael remained at the manor, protected by guards she trusted. Bringing him would have been suicide. The banquet hall blazed with chandeliers in excess, tables laden with food while citizens starved, nobles laughing while the empire crumbled, gold-inlaid floors stained with the invisible blood of everyone who had died to maintain this illusion of power. Serafina wanted to burn it all down. Instead, she smiled and played her role. Duchess, diplomat, survivor. Emperor Valen sat at the head table, surrounded by sycophants and concubines. He saw Serafina and gestured her forward. Duchess Vale. How generous of you to attend. Serafina curtsied. I wouldn't miss it, Your Majesty. And your little project? I noticed you came alone. He's a child, not decoration, Your Majesty. Valen's eyes gleamed. Of course. Although Lord Blackmore tells me the boy has become quite protective of you. Some might call it obsessive, some might call it loyalty, and others might call it dangerous. Serafina met his gaze directly. With respect, Your Majesty, I believe you invited me here for a reason beyond discussing my household. Valen leaned back, amused. Perceptive as always. Yes, I have a proposal. House Meridian has been seeking alliance through marriage. Their youngest son is 25, handsome, politically connected. An excellent match for a duchess of your particular status. Serafina's stomach turned. You want me to marry. I want you to secure your legacy. An heir, stability, protection. From whom? Valen's smile sharpened. From yourself. You've become reckless, Duchess. Protecting criminals, defying social conventions, making enemies. He leaned forward. I'm offering you a way out. Marry, produce an heir, send the boy away. And all this unpleasantness disappears. And if I refuse, then your protection ends. House Vale becomes just another target in an empire full of wolves. Serafina's hands clenched beneath the table. You're threatening me. I'm saving you. There's a difference. No, Serafina said quietly. There really isn't. She stood, ignoring the gasps from nearby nobles. I appreciate your concern, Your Majesty, but I'll secure my own legacy. She left before Valen could respond, walking through the banquet hall with her head high and her heart hammering. Behind her, the Emperor's laughter followed like a curse. Serafina returned to Vale Manor near midnight to find chaos. Guards shouted in the courtyard. Servants ran through corridors. And in the center of it all, Maris stood holding a bloody kitchen knife. What happened? Serafina demanded. The housekeeper's face was ashen. Assassins, Your Grace. 3 of them. They came over the east wall, targeting your quarters. Serafina's blood went cold. And Kael? Maris pointed toward the garden. Serafina ran. She found Kael standing beneath the apple trees, illuminated by torchlight. Blood covered his hands and face. At his feet lay 2 bodies. Assassins. Kael looked up when Serafina approached, silver eyes empty of everything except exhaustion. I heard them, he said quietly, breaking in. So I followed, and when they tried to reach your rooms, He gestured at the bodies. Serafina felt reality tilt. This 13-year-old boy had killed 2 trained assassins to protect her. Are you hurt? Kael shook his head. Serafina knelt, taking his bloodied hands in hers. You saved my life. I couldn't let them hurt you. His voice cracked on the last word, and suddenly he wasn't a killer or a monster, just a terrified boy who had done something horrifying because the only person who ever showed him kindness was in danger. Serafina pulled him close, not caring about blood or consequences or the future she couldn't change. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you. Guards arrived, questions flying. Serafina answered mechanically while Kael stood silent beside her, still holding her hand like a lifeline. Later, after the bodies were removed and reports filed and the household settled, Serafina found Kael in his room. He had washed the blood away but couldn't seem to stop staring at his hands. I killed them, he said. I didn't hesitate, didn't think, just killed them to protect me. Does that make it right? Serafina sat beside him. I don't know. Maybe there is no right, just choices and consequences. I'm turning into the monster everyone says I am. No, Serafina said firmly. You're becoming someone who protects people he loves. That's different. Is it? She didn't have an answer. They sat in silence while moonlight streamed through windows, and somewhere in the distance, an empire continued its slow collapse toward the moment when prophecy would finally catch up with both of them. And Serafina realized with terrible clarity that she had already crossed a line she could never uncross. Because despite everything, despite knowing he would kill her, despite seeing the darkness growing inside him, despite every rational reason to send him away, she couldn't. She loved him. Not romantically, not like a mother, though that was closest, but something deeper and more complicated. The kind of love that destroys everything it touches because it refuses to let go. The kind of love that burns empires. Kale looked at her, silver eyes reflecting moonlight. What happens now? Serafina took his hand. Now we survive. Together. It was a promise she knew she couldn't keep, but she made it anyway. Because sometimes the only thing worse than dying is letting the people you love face the darkness alone, even when you know that love is exactly what will kill you. 3 years changed everything except the prophecy. Kael turned 16 in a spring that felt like the end of something nobody could name. He had grown tall and sharp-edged, all angles and coiled violence wrapped in expensive clothes that couldn't quite civilize him. His silver eyes still burned with that same feral intensity, but now there was calculation behind them. Purpose. The kind of focus that made experienced soldiers step back when he entered a room. Serafina watched him become dangerous and couldn't decide if she was proud or terrified. Probably both. The Empire had noticed too. Whispers followed Kael through the capital like smoke. The Duchess's shadow, they called him. The boy who killed assassins at 13, the monster Veil kept on a leash. Some nobles claimed he wasn't human at all, that demon blood ran through his veins explaining those impossible eyes. Let them talk, Serafina thought. Fear kept enemies at a distance, and they had plenty of enemies now. She stood in her study reviewing reports from her network of informants, each document another piece of evidence that the empire was collapsing. Food riots in the western provinces. Military desertion rates climbing. 3 noble houses had fallen in the past year alone. Assets seized by the crown under fabricated charges. Emperor Valen was consolidating power the only way dying empires knew how, through terror and purges. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Come in. Kael entered carrying a leather satchel, his movements economical and precise. He had started training with the manor's master-at-arms 2 years ago and absorbed combat technique like he'd been born for it. Which maybe he had been. Violence recognized its own. The intelligence you requested from the southern border, he said, setting the satchel on her desk. Lord Caro's troop movements, supply manifests, and something else. What else? Letters. Correspondence between Caro and Emperor Valen discussing House Vale. Serafina's pulse quickened. She opened the satchel and pulled out carefully copied documents. Her eyes scanned text that confirmed her worst suspicions. They're planning something, Kael said quietly. I couldn't determine specifics, but your name appears frequently. Always in context of problems requiring solutions. Solutions meant assassination, or forced marriage, or public humiliation designed to destroy political influence. The Empire had refined these methods over centuries. How did you obtain these? Serafina asked. Do you want details or deniability? She looked at him sharply. Kael's expression remained neutral, but she saw blood on his cuffs. Fresh blood, poorly washed. Kael. The courier was alive when I left him, Kael said. Unconscious but breathing. He'll wake with a headache and missing memories. Nothing permanent. You can't keep doing this. Doing what? Protecting you? His voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. Not quite anger, something rawer, possessive. You're risking yourself, Serafina said carefully. Every action like this puts a target on your back. There's already a target on my back. On yours too. At least this way I'm doing something about it. He turned toward the window, shoulders rigid. You think I don't know what people say about me? That I'm your attack dog? Your monster? I know exactly what I am. And what's that? Yours. The word landed between them like a blade. Serafina felt something twist in her chest. The boy who had been silent and broken 3 years ago had become this. Someone who claimed belonging like a weapon. Someone who would bleed for her without hesitation and call it loyalty instead of the obsession everyone else saw. She should push him away, create distance. Every strategic instinct screamed this attachment would destroy them both. But she couldn't, because somewhere along the way, Kyle had stopped being a charity project or a responsibility. He had become essential, the only person in her life who didn't want something from her except her survival, even if that devotion would eventually kill her. Kyle, she started, then stopped. What could she say? That she appreciated him? That she was terrified of him? That she loved him in a way that had no name and no future? He turned back, silver eyes meeting hers. You're afraid of me. It wasn't a question. Sometimes, Serafina admitted. Good, Kyle said. You should be. But I need you to understand something. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair, the gesture strangely formal. Everything I am, everything I've become, is because you gave me a reason to survive. You saved me when I was nothing. So yes, I'm dangerous. Yes, I'm the monster they say I am. But only to people who threaten you. His hands clenched into fists. The entire empire could burn, and I wouldn't care, as long as you're safe. Serafina felt her breath catch. This was the moment. The point where she should explain that kind of devotion was toxic, that healthy relationships didn't require one person to sacrifice their humanity for another's protection. Instead, she reached out and touched his face, feeling him lean into her palm like a starving man offered food. I know, she whispered. And that was the problem. She did know. Knew exactly what Kyle was becoming and couldn't bring herself to stop it because she needed him just as desperately as he needed her. They were destroying each other through love that looked like salvation. Duchess. Summer brought the first real crisis. Lord Theron Blackmore returned to Vale Manor, this time with Imperial soldiers and a writ signed by Emperor Valen himself. Serafina met them in the courtyard, Kyle standing slightly behind her right shoulder like a shadow with teeth. Lord Blackmore, she said coldly. To what do I owe this invasion? Blackmore smiled, all predator confidence. By order of His Majesty, I'm here to conduct an inspection of House Vale's financial records. There are questions regarding tax evasion and misappropriation of imperial funds. Lies, obviously. This was harassment dressed as bureaucracy. I maintain meticulous records, Serafina said. You're welcome to review them. How generous! Blackmore's eyes slid toward Kyle. And perhaps while I'm here, I should interview your ward. There are outstanding questions about his activities. Kyle's hand moved toward the knife at his belt. Serafina caught his wrist without looking, a subtle warning. He's under my guardianship. Any questions go through me. Is that so? Blackmore stepped closer. Because I have reports of a young man matching his description attacking Imperial couriers, stealing correspondence, committing acts of violence against crown representatives. Rumors, Serafina said. Nothing more. Then you won't mind if I conduct a formal investigation. The soldiers behind Blackmore shifted, hands on weapons. The message was clear. Resist, and this becomes violent. Serafina calculated odds. Fighting would give Valen excuse to destroy House Vale completely. Compliance bought time but put Kyle at risk. No good options. Just degrees of disaster. Very well, she said finally. But the investigation will be supervised by neutral magistrates, and any interrogation of my ward will occur in my presence. Blackmore's smile widened. Of course. We're all civilized people here. He wasn't civilized. He was a weapon Valen pointed at inconvenient problems. But Serafina could play this game too. Corvin, prepare the financial records for Lord Blackmore's review. Maris, ensure our guests are appropriately accommodated. She emphasized the word guests with just enough acid to draw blood. Blackmore bowed mockingly. Your hospitality is legendary, Duchess. The soldiers moved into the manor like an occupying force. Kyle's entire body vibrated with rage. We should kill them. No, they're here to destroy you. I know, but killing them only proves we're everything the Empire claims we are. Kyle turned toward her, silver eyes burning. And what if that's exactly what we need to be? The question hung between them like smoke. The investigation lasted 3 days and found nothing because there was nothing to find. Serafina ran House Vale with ruthless efficiency. Every coin accounted for, Every transaction documented. Her books were cleaner than the emperor's. But that wasn't the point. Blackmore used the investigation as cover to spread poison throughout the household. He questioned servants about Kael's behavior, asked guards about suspicious activities, planted suggestions that House Vale was harboring a terrorist and the Duchess was either complicit or dangerously naive. Serafina watched her reputation fracture in real time. On the third night, she found Kael on the manor's roof, staring at the capital's lights. He didn't turn when she approached. "You should let me kill him," Kael said quietly. "That would solve nothing. It would solve one problem, and create a dozen more." Serafina sat beside him, their shoulders almost touching. Violence isn't always the answer. It's the only language the Empire understands. He wasn't wrong. The Empire had been built on conquest and maintained through brutality. Trying to fight power with diplomacy was like bringing philosophy to a knife fight. But Serafina had spent 3 years trying to teach Kael there were other ways. That strength didn't require cruelty. That survival didn't demand becoming the monster everyone expected. Now she wondered if she'd been lying to both of them. "What if you're wrong?" Kael asked, as if reading her thoughts. "What if mercy is just slow suicide?" "Then we die," Serafina said. "But at least we die as ourselves." Kael finally looked at her. "You really believe that?" "I have to." "Why?" "Because the alternative is becoming Valen, becoming the Empire. And if we do that, what was the point of surviving?" Kael's jaw tightened. "The point is you survive. Everything else is just noise." Serafina felt her heart crack. This boy who had been so broken, who she'd tried to piece back together with kindness and structure and hope, had learned entirely the wrong lesson. He had learned that love meant annihilation, that protecting someone required destroying yourself, that the only thing worse than death was letting the people you care about die first, and she had taught him that. Kael stood abruptly. "I need to patrol the grounds. It's midnight, exactly when assassins prefer to work." He disappeared down the roof access before she could respond. Serafina sat alone under stars that looked like broken glass, wondering when protection had transformed into obsession and if there was any functional difference. Blackmore left the next morning with nothing but manufactured suspicions and a smug expression that promised this wasn't over. The staff gathered in the entrance hall as Imperial soldiers mounted horses and rode toward the capital. Nobody spoke until they disappeared beyond the gates. Maris approached Serafina carefully. "Your Grace, the household is frightened. Soldiers asking questions. Lord Blackmore making threats. People are wondering if it's safe to remain in your service." Serafina's stomach dropped. "Are staff leaving?" 3 servants gave notice yesterday. 2 guards resigned this morning. She had expected this. Fear was contagious, and the Empire had just infected her household with the understanding that House Vale was a target. "Anyone who wishes to leave has my blessing," Serafina said quietly. "I won't hold it against them. And those who stay will have my loyalty and protection, for whatever that's worth." Maris nodded stiffly and withdrew. Kael materialized at Serafina's elbow like he'd been summoned. They're rats fleeing a sinking ship. They're frightened people making rational choices. Rational would be staying with someone who gives a damn about them instead of running to an empire that views them as disposable. He wasn't wrong. The Empire treated common people like resources to be extracted and discarded. House Vale at least offered dignity and fair wages. But dignity didn't stop assassination attempts. "Come with me," Serafina said. She led him to the manor's private armory, a room few people knew existed. Inside were weapons her family had collected over generations: swords, daggers, crossbows, armor that had seen real warfare. Serafina opened a locked cabinet and removed a blade. It was beautiful in the way weapons could be. Steel folded 100 times until the metal sang when drawn. The hilt was wrapped in black leather, the crossguard engraved with the Vale family crest. "This belonged to my great-grandfather," Serafina said. "He carried it during the succession wars. It's killed kings and princes and men who thought they were untouchable." She held it out to Kael. He stared at the blade like it might bite him. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because I'm tired of pretending we have options we don't actually have." Serafina's voice came out harder than intended. "The Empire wants me destroyed. They'll keep sending people like Blackmore until they succeed. Diplomacy is failing, so maybe you're right. Maybe violence is the only language they understand. Kael took the sword slowly, his hands reverent on the steel. You're saying I can fight. I'm saying if we're going to survive, we need to be smarter and more dangerous than everyone hunting us. She met his eyes. But there are rules. Name them. No killing unless absolutely necessary. No collateral damage. No innocent casualties. We're not the Empire. We don't slaughter people to make a point. What if the point needs to be made? Then we find another way. Kael tested the sword's weight, the blade moving through air with a sound like tearing silk. He looked at her, silver eyes reflecting steel. You're giving me permission to be the monster. No, Serafina said firmly. I'm asking you to be a weapon with a conscience. There's a difference. Is there? She hoped so. But standing in an armory surrounded by instruments of death, while handing her ward a sword that had killed royalty, Serafina wondered if she was making a strategic choice or just accelerating their mutual destruction. Kael sheathed the blade and bowed slightly. I won't fail you. After he left, Serafina remained in the armory, staring at empty weapon racks and trying to remember when survival had required arming a boy she knew would eventually kill her. The answer came quietly, the moment she saved him. Everything after that had just been falling with style. News from the capital arrived 2 weeks later via one of Serafina's informants. Emperor Valen was hosting a royal banquet, and attendance was mandatory for all major noble houses, including House Vale. Serafina read the invitation 3 times, searching for hidden meaning. Valen rarely hosted events without ulterior motives. This was either an opportunity or a trap, probably both. She found Kael in the training yard, drilling with the master-at-arms. He moved like liquid violence, the sword an extension of his body. The older man couldn't land a single touch. When Kael noticed Serafina, he stopped immediately and crossed the yard. What's wrong? We're summoned to court. Royal banquet in 3 weeks. Kael's expression darkened. Don't go? I don't have a choice. Refusing would be open rebellion. Good. Serafina blinked. You want me to rebel against the Emperor? I want you to stop pretending we're going to survive by following rules the Empire doesn't follow themselves. He was right, but admitting it meant crossing a line she'd spent years defending. If I refuse this summons, Valen will send an army. Then we fight. Against the Empire? With what forces? With whoever values survival over submission. Kael stepped closer. You have allies, Serafina. Minor houses who are sick of Valen's purges. Merchants who've been strangled by imperial taxes. Common people who'd rally behind someone offering something other than more suffering. You're talking about civil war. I'm talking about not waiting for the executioner's axe. Serafina felt the ground shift beneath her. 3 years ago, Kael had been a broken child who flinched at raised voices. Now he stood before her proposing revolution with the calm certainty of someone who had calculated odds and accepted consequences. She had created this. Taken a damaged boy and taught him to survive in a world where mercy was weakness. Now survival had evolved into something far more dangerous. We're not ready for war, she said finally. Then we get ready, or we die pretending to be civilized. His silver eyes held hers, and Serafina saw the future stretching between them, violence and fire and Empire's collapse. The exact vision she'd been trying to prevent. Except now she wondered if preventing it was even possible. If prophecy was destination or warning, if the difference even mattered. I'll attend the banquet, she said, but we prepare contingencies. If Valen makes a move against House Vale, we respond with overwhelming force. Kael's expression shifted into something that might have been satisfaction or might have been hunger. Finally. He left to resume training, and Serafina stood alone in the yard, watching him destroy a practice dummy with precision strikes that suggested he'd been imagining enemies with faces. She had spent 3 years trying to save a boy from becoming a monster. Now she was weaponizing him. The only question left was whether they'd point in the same direction when the moment came. The royal banquet was exactly as grotesque as expected. Serafina arrived wearing crimson silk that matched her house colors, diamonds at her throat like a challenge. Kael stood beside her in formal black, the sword she'd given him concealed beneath his coat. Nobody questioned his presence. The Duchess's shadow had become an accepted reality. The palace blazed with excess. Crystal chandeliers throwing fractured light across marble floors, tables laden with food that could feed a province. Nobles draped in jewelry worth more than most people earned in lifetimes. Emperor Valen held court at the center of controlled chaos, looking older than last time. Illness had carved lines into his face, turned his skin papery and thin. He was dying, Serafina realized. Maybe not this year, but soon, which made him infinitely more dangerous. Dying men did desperate things. Duchess Vale, Valen called out when he noticed her. How delightful that you could attend. And you brought your pet. Kale's hand moved toward his concealed sword. Serafina caught his wrist in warning. Your Majesty, she said evenly, thank you for the invitation. Of course. I wanted to personally address rumors that House Vale might be experiencing difficulties. Financial troubles, staff desertions, whispers of disloyalty. The room went silent. Every noble turned to watch. This was the trap. House Vale remains strong, Serafina said carefully, and loyal to the Empire. How wonderful. Valen leaned forward. Then you won't mind a small demonstration of that loyalty. He gestured to a side entrance. Guards dragged in a prisoner, Lord Caro, the man whose correspondence Kyle had stolen. He looked broken, beaten, terrified. Lord Caro has confessed to treason, Valen announced. Conspiracy against the crown. Theft of imperial documents. He claims House Vale was involved. Serafina's blood went cold. Lies, she said. House Vale has no connection to Lord Caro's crimes. No? Valen's eyes gleamed. Then you won't object to personally executing him. A simple demonstration that House Vale stands with the Empire against traitors. He held out a dagger. The room held its breath. Serafina understood immediately. This was a test. Execute Caro and prove loyalty through bloodshed. Refuse and confirm suspicions of treason. Either way, Valen won. She looked at Caro. The man was guilty of nothing except having correspondence stolen by her ward. Killing him would be murder to satisfy political theater, but refusing would doom House Vale. Serafina reached for the dagger. Kyle caught her wrist. Don't! She looked at him sharply. His silver eyes burned with something beyond rage, beyond calculation, pure protective instinct that didn't care about consequences. He's forcing you to become him, Kale said quietly. Making you kill to prove loyalty. Once you start, you'll never stop. Serafina felt the room's attention focused on them like heat. Every noble, every guard, every servant watching to see what House Vale would do. She could kill Caro, save herself through cruelty, become exactly what the Empire demanded. Or she could refuse, confirm every suspicion, turn House Vale into the enemy Valen claimed they were. No good options, just different flavors of disaster. She looked at Emperor Valen and saw him smiling, confident she'd break. That's what made her decision. No, Serafina said clearly. I won't murder an innocent man to prove loyalty to a corrupt empire. The room exploded into shocked whispers. Valen's smile vanished. You refuse? I refuse. Then you confirm what I've long suspected. House Vale is traitorous. Guards, arrest them both. Soldiers moved forward. Kyle drew his sword. The sound of steel clearing leather silenced the room. He stood between Serafina and the guards, blade held in perfect form, his body language screaming that anyone approaching would die. Stand down, Valen commanded. Kale smiled, and Serafina's breath caught because it wasn't human. It was the expression of something that had finally stopped pretending to be civilized. Make me. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. Then Kale spoke again, his voice carrying through the banquet hall with terrible clarity. Every person in this room knows the Emperor is dying. You can smell the rot from here. So you're all calculating who comes next, who to back, where to place your bets. He took a step forward, and armed guards retreated. Let me save you the trouble. Emperor Valen dies with no heir, no succession plan, just chaos and desperate men fighting over scraps. And when that happens, you'll all come begging House Vale for protection because we're the only ones who gave a damn about anything except power. Pure sedition delivered with the confidence of someone who had stopped caring about consequences. Serafina should stop him, should de-escalate before this became irreversible. Instead, she stood at his shoulder and spoke directly to Valen. Call off your guards, Your Majesty. Or my ward demonstrates exactly why they call him the Duchess's shadow. Valen stared at them, calculation flickering across his features. Then he laughed, the sound brittle as breaking ice. Fascinating. The boy thinks he's dangerous. I don't think, Kale said. I know. Prove it. Kale moved. One moment he stood beside Seraphina. The next, he was across the room, sword pressed against Lord Blackmore's throat. The entire sequence took maybe 2 seconds. Blackmore froze, eyes wide. Kale leaned close and whispered something. Seraphina couldn't hear the words, but she saw Blackmore's face drain of color. Then Kale returned to her side as if nothing had happened. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. What did you say to him? Kale sheathed his sword. Just explaining the price of threatening House Vale. Blackmore remained frozen, something dark spreading across the front of his expensive trousers. He'd pissed himself. Valen's expression turned cold. You've made your position clear, Duchess. House Vale is now formally declared enemy of the Empire. Arrest warrants will be issued. Assets seized. Anyone harboring you will be considered traitors. He stood, leaning heavily on the throne. You've chosen civil war. I hope it was worth it. It was, Seraphina said, surprising herself with the truth of it. Because now everyone knows what the Empire really is. A dying tyrant demanding blood to prove relevance. Valen's face twisted with rage. Kill them! Guards moved forward. Kale grabbed Seraphina's hand and they ran. Behind them, the palace erupted into chaos. They burst through side corridors, Kyle somehow knowing the layout like he'd memorized it. Guards shouted. Alarms rang. Steel clashed against steel as loyalist soldiers fought whoever Kyle had somehow recruited. When did you plan this? Seraphina gasped. 3 weeks ago, the night you agreed to come. You knew this would happen. I knew Valen would try something, so I prepared. They emerged into the palace gardens where horses waited, already saddled. Kyle lifted Seraphina onto one, then mounted his own. Where do we go? Somewhere Valen can't reach. Somewhere we build what comes next. They rode into darkness while behind them the imperial palace burned, not from fire but from the collapse of certainty that had held the empire together for centuries. And Seraphina realized with absolute clarity that this was the moment everything changed, the point of no return. She had spent 3 years trying to prevent her vision, Kyle standing over her death. Instead, she'd created something far more dangerous, a boy willing to burn an empire just to keep her alive. They rode for 3 days through territory that became progressively hostile. The horses were excellent stock, bred for endurance rather than speed, which meant they could maintain punishing pace without collapsing. Kyle had planned that too, apparently. Had planned everything while Seraphina played diplomat and pretended civilization still mattered. She should be angry about his manipulation. Instead, she felt exhausted relief that someone had been thinking strategically while she clung to fantasies about negotiation. They stopped at a safe house on the 3rd night, a fortified manor belonging to House Meridian. Lord Castor Meridian met them at the gates personally, a broad man in his 50s with military bearing and calculating eyes. Duchess Vale, he said, bowing formally. My house is yours. Thank you, Lord Meridian. I appreciate the risk you're taking. Risk implies uncertainty. Castor smiled grimly. Harboring you is guaranteed suicide. But the Emperor declared war on my house 2 months ago through taxation that would bankrupt us within a year. So we're already dead. Might as well choose how we die. He led them inside where a war council had already assembled. Minor nobles, displaced merchants, former military officers who had been purged for insufficient loyalty. Maybe 30 people total, which was pathetic compared to the Empire's resources, but more than Seraphina expected. Kyle had recruited them all. When? She asked quietly as they entered the council chamber. Over the past year, Kyle said. Every time you sent me on errands to the capital. Every military assignment. I wasn't just following orders, I was building networks. You've been planning rebellion for a year, I've been preparing for survival. There's a difference. Is there? Kyle looked at her directly. You taught me to see patterns. Read behavior. Understand that powerful people destroy what they can't control. So yes, I prepared. Because I knew eventually Valen would force a choice, and you'd choose integrity over submission. He had known her better than she knew herself. The council meeting lasted hours. Maps spread across tables. Intelligence reports reviewed. Supply chains analyzed. Everyone contributing pieces of a strategy that might let them survive what came next. The Empire has 40,000 troops, Lord Castor said, marking positions on the map. We have maybe 3,000 if we're generous. Any direct confrontation ends in massacre. Then we don't confront directly, Kyle said. We fracture their supply lines, target logistics, make the empire bleed resources until maintaining control costs more than letting us go. Guerrilla warfare, an older general muttered. Dishonorable. Effective, Kyle corrected. Honor is what people with armies can afford. We have desperation and creativity. Serafina watched him command the room with casual authority that would have seemed impossible 3 years ago. The broken boy had become this, a strategist comfortable discussing how to dismantle an empire. She had created a revolutionary. The meeting concluded near dawn with everyone exhausted but aligned. Houses would coordinate resistance. Merchants would choke trade routes. Former soldiers would train militia. It was barely a plan, more like organized chaos, but it was something. After everyone dispersed, Serafina found Kyle on the manor's battlements watching the sunrise. "You've been busy," she said. "Someone had to be." "Why didn't you tell me?" Kyle's hands gripped the stone wall. "Because you would have tried to stop me. Would have said we needed to exhaust diplomatic options, that violence should be last resort. All the principled positions that get people killed while they wait for mercy that never comes. You don't trust my judgment. I trust your judgment is informed by values the empire doesn't share. You think if you're reasonable enough, kind enough, strategic enough, eventually people will recognize your humanity and respond in kind." His silver eyes met hers. "But the empire doesn't care about humanity. It cares about control. And you can't negotiate with people who view your existence as threat." He was right. Serafina had spent years trying to be the reasonable one, the diplomatic one, believing structure and law mattered. But law was just violence with better branding, and structure only protected people the empire valued. She had been naive. The realization tasted like ash. "I should have listened to you sooner," she said quietly. "You listened when it mattered." Kale turned back toward the sunrise. "Now we survive. Together." It should have sounded reassuring. Instead, it sounded like a promise neither of them could keep. The Empire's response came faster than expected. Imperial troops arrived at House Meridian's borders within a week, led by General Marcus Voss, a career military officer known for putting down rebellions with brutal efficiency. He didn't bother with negotiation, just surrounded the manor and demanded surrender. Lord Castor refused. The siege began at noon. Serafina watched from the battlements as soldiers positioned siege equipment, archers, cavalry. They had overwhelming force and knew it. This wasn't warfare, it was extermination. "We can't hold," Lord Castor said beside her. "Maybe 3 days before they breach the walls. After that, it's slaughter." "Then we don't hold," Kale said, appearing at Serafina's other side. "We evacuate." "To where?" Castor demanded. "They've surrounded us." "Not completely." Kale pointed toward the eastern forest. "There's a smuggler's route through those woods. Narrow, easily missed. Gets us past the siege line and into the mountains." "How do you know about smuggler routes?" "I spent a year preparing for this." "You think I didn't scout escape paths?" Castor studied the forest. "Even if we reach the mountains, the Empire will hunt us. Let them hunt. Mountains favor defenders. We buy time, regroup, coordinate with other resistance houses." It was desperate, but possible, which made it the best option they had. Serafina made the decision. "We evacuate tonight, everyone who wants to come. No one forced. Some will stay," Castor warned. "Choose death over exile. That's their right." The older lord nodded grimly. "I'll begin preparations." He left to organize what would either be strategic retreat or panicked flight depending on how the next 12 hours unfolded. Kyle remained, his expression unreadable. "You're gambling everything on this," Serafina said. "I'm gambling everything on you. The rest is just logistics. What if I'm not worth it?" Kale smiled, and it was the saddest thing Serafina had ever seen. "You saved me when I was nothing. You gave me reason to survive. Worth isn't calculated by empires or markets or anyone's opinion except the person who decides to care." He touched her hand briefly. "You decided I was worth saving, so yes, you're worth burning empires for." He walked away before she could respond. Serafina stood alone watching soldiers prepare to destroy everything she'd built, and wondered when love had become weaponized devotion too dangerous to survive but impossible to abandon. Well, The evacuation began at midnight. 37 people chose to leave, 12 stayed, old retainers who preferred death in familiar places to uncertainty in mountains. Serafina hugged each one, knowing she was sentencing them to execution. They left through the eastern gate in small groups, moving silent through darkness toward the forest. Kael led, navigating by instinct and preparation. Behind them, the manor burned. Lord Castor's final order: destroy everything the Empire might use. Let them have ashes. They reached the smuggler's path just as dawn broke. The route was exactly what Kael promised: narrow, overgrown, invisible unless you knew where to look. They moved single file through trees that swallowed sound and light. Behind them, shouts echoed. The Empire had discovered their escape. "Move faster," Kael commanded. They weren't soldiers. They were nobles and merchants and servants who had never marched through wilderness. People stumbled. Children cried. The elderly struggled with terrain. Progress was agonizingly slow. The Empire's pursuit grew louder. Kael fell back to Serafina's position. "They're gaining. How much time do we have?" "Minutes, maybe less." "What do we do?" Kael's expression hardened. "Someone needs to slow them down." "Absolutely not." Serafina grabbed his arm. "You're not sacrificing yourself." "I'm not." He pulled free gently. "I'm buying time. There's a difference." "Kael, you taught me survival requires hard choices. This is one." He drew the sword she'd given him, the blade singing as it cleared the sheath. Then he turned toward the sounds of pursuit. Serafina's heart stopped. "You can't fight an entire unit alone. Watch me." He moved into the trees like smoke, disappearing between shadows. Serafina wanted to follow, wanted to drag him back, wanted to scream that this wasn't survival, it was suicide dressed as strategy. But the group was still moving, still depending on her leadership, and stopping meant everyone died instead of just Kael. She forced herself forward. Behind them, steel clashed, men screamed, then silence so complete it felt like the forest holding its breath. Minutes passed like centuries. Then Kael emerged from the trees, clothes torn, blood covering his arms and face. He was limping, but alive. "Keep moving," he said quietly. Nobody questioned him. They walked for hours, putting distance between themselves and whatever Kael had done to buy them escape. Finally, as afternoon light filtered through branches, they reached a clearing where the smuggler's path connected to mountain trails. "Here," Kael said. "We split into smaller groups, harder to track." Lord Castor organized the division while Serafina pulled Kael aside. She examined his injuries, deep cuts on his arms, bruising across his ribs, but nothing immediately fatal. "How many?" she asked. "Does it matter?" "Yes." 7. There were 7 soldiers, now there are none. He said it without emotion, statement of fact. Problem solved through application of violence. Serafina felt something twist in her chest. This boy who had been so broken, who she'd tried to teach compassion and restraint, had just killed 7 people without hesitation, and she was grateful for it. That was the part that destroyed her. Not that Kael had become a killer, but that she had become someone who needed him to be one. "Thank you," she said quietly. Kael looked at her with those impossible silver eyes. "You don't need to thank me for protecting you. That's not transaction. That's purpose." He walked away to help organize the group division. Serafina stood alone in the clearing, covered in other people's blood and her own compromises, wondering when survival had required becoming everything she'd sworn she'd never be. They reached the mountain stronghold 3 days later. It was old fortress from pre-imperial times, built into cliff face and designed for defense. Kael had somehow secured it months ago, stocked with supplies and weapons. Another piece of preparation Serafina hadn't known about. The fortress could hold maybe 200 people comfortably. They had 43. It would have to be enough. Lord Castor established command structure, while others settled into quarters that smelled of stone and isolation. Serafina walked the battlements, studying approaches and calculating how long they could hold against serious assault. Not long, she concluded. Maybe weeks if the Empire was slow, days if they committed resources. "We're not staying here," Kael said, joining her. "Then what's the point?" "Base of operations. Somewhere to coordinate resistance while we build actual strategy." "Which is?" Kale pulled out documents, letters, contracts, pledges of support from houses across the empire. Dozens of them, all secretly negotiated over the past year. You've been recruiting half the nobility, Serafina said, stunned. The half that's tired of Valen's purges, minor houses who know they're next, merchants strangled by imperial taxes, military officers sick of executing civilians. He spread the documents on stone. The empire is fracturing. Has been for years. Valen holds it together through terror, but terror is expensive. Every execution creates enemies. Every purge generates resistance. He's been bleeding support and didn't realize it. Until now. Until you gave them alternative. Someone worth following. Kale's silver eyes met hers. You think I'm building this for me? I'm building it for you. Every alliance, every pledge, every piece of this rebellion exists because people believe in the Duchess who refused to murder innocents, who chose integrity over survival. Serafina felt breathless. You're creating an empire. I'm creating a chance. What you do with it is your choice. Before she could respond, a guard shouted from the gate tower. Riders approaching, single horse, flying white flag. Envoy, Lord Castor said, joining them. The Empire wants to negotiate. Or it's a trap. Only one way to know. They assembled in the fortress courtyard as the rider approached. Young man, maybe 25, wearing imperial colors but looking terrified. He dismounted carefully, hands visible and empty. I carry message from Emperor Valen, he said, for Duchess Vale. Speak, Serafina commanded. The envoy cleared his throat. His Majesty offers terms. Surrender yourself, and the boy called Kael face trial for treason. In exchange, everyone else receives full pardon and safe passage. It was exactly the offer Serafina expected. Valen wanted her and Kael specifically. Everyone else was negotiable. And if we refuse, Kael asked, total war. The Emperor has authorized unlimited resources to crush this rebellion. Every person harboring you will be executed. Every house supporting you will be destroyed. Your families, your children, everyone. The envoy looked genuinely sorry. His Majesty prefers mercy, but he will not hesitate to demonstrate what happens to traitors. Serafina felt 43 pairs of eyes on her. These people had followed her into exile, had abandoned homes and titles and certainty because she'd given them alternative to imperial tyranny. Now that alternative meant watching their families die. How long do we have to decide? Lord Castor asked. 3 days. After that, the offer expires and total war begins. The envoy remounted and rode away, leaving silence heavy as execution. Finally, Lord Castor spoke. Your Grace, I need to be honest. If you don't surrender, some of these people will leave, will choose their families over resistance. I understand. Do you? Because I'm one of them. Castor's voice cracked. My wife is still in the capital, my grandchildren. If you refuse surrender, they die. And I can't let that happen. Serafina felt her world narrowing to single terrible choice. Surrender and die. Refuse and watch innocent people pay the price. No good options, just different flavors of disaster. I need time to think, she said. You have 3 days, use them well. He walked away, shoulders bowed under weight of impossible decisions. Kael remained, his expression unreadable. You're thinking about surrendering, he said. Not a question. Serafina couldn't meet his eyes. If it saves everyone else? It doesn't save anyone. Valen will execute us publicly, then purge everyone anyway. He's offering false mercy to fracture our support. Once we're dead, there's no one to rally behind. Then what do I do? Let families die to preserve rebellion that might not even work? You survive. You fight. You become what the Empire fears most. A tyrant? A threat. Kael stepped closer. You've spent your entire life trying to be good, trying to be principled, trying to prove nobility meant something other than hereditary cruelty. But the Empire doesn't reward goodness. It exploits it. His hands clenched into fists. So maybe it's time to stop being good and start being dangerous. Serafina finally looked at him. You're asking me to become Valen. I'm asking you to become someone who survives. There's a difference. Is there? The question hung between them like smoke. Serafina didn't sleep that night. She walked the fortress walls, watching moonlight paint mountains silver, trying to find answer that wouldn't cost everything. There wasn't one. Surrender meant death but saved families. Fighting meant watching innocent people die for rebellion that might fail anyway. Both options required sacrificing something essential. She thought about the boy she'd saved 3 years ago, the broken child who had trusted her to make him human again. She'd tried so hard to teach him compassion and mercy and all the values that supposedly separated civilization from barbarism. But maybe those values only worked when everyone agreed to follow them, and the Empire had never agreed. Footsteps behind her. Serafina turned to find Lord Castor approaching, looking older than his years. "I've been thinking about your decision," he said quietly, "and I need you to know something." Serafina waited. "If you surrender, I'll still lose my family. Valen won't stop with you. He'll purge everyone who supported this rebellion, because that's what tyrants do. The offer of mercy is lie designed to make you give up. So there's no winning? No. But there's surviving long enough to make him regret starting this war." Castor's jaw tightened. "My wife knew the risk when I joined you, knew the Empire might retaliate, and she told me to fight anyway. Because living under Valen's Empire wasn't living, it was just slower dying." He met Serafina's eyes. "So don't surrender to save people who've already chosen their side. Fight. Make him bleed for every inch. Show the Empire what it costs to destroy people who refuse to break." He walked away before Serafina could respond. She stood alone on the battlements, feeling weight of leadership that required being responsible for other people's deaths. It would be so much easier to surrender, to accept execution and let everyone else survive. But Castor was right. Valen would purge them anyway. There was no gentle option, just hard choices and harder consequences. Serafina made her decision. Boten. She called the council together at dawn. Everyone assembled in the fortress's great hall, exhausted and frightened and waiting for verdict that would determine whether they lived or died. Serafina stood before them, this collection of refugees who had bet everything on her leadership. "The Emperor offered surrender terms," she began. "Myself and Kael in exchange for everyone else's safety." The room held its breath. "I'm refusing." Shocked silence. Because Lord Castor was right. Valen's mercy is lie. He'll execute us, then purge everyone anyway. That's how empires maintain control, through terror disguised as justice. She walked through the assembled group, meeting eyes. "So instead, we fight. We make the Empire bleed. We coordinate with allied houses and turn this into civil war. Valen can't afford to lose. We stop asking for mercy and start demanding change." Her voice hardened. "And yes, people will die. Maybe all of us. But we'll die fighting instead of begging. We'll die proving the Empire can't destroy everyone who refuses to submit." She stopped at the center of the hall. "Anyone who wants to leave has 3 days. No judgment, no consequences. But if you stay committed, because there's no going back from this." Long silence. Then Lord Castor stepped forward. "I stay." One by one, others joined. 43 people choosing uncertain death over certain submission. Kael watched from the shadows, silver eyes reflecting torchlight, and Serafina saw something that looked like pride, or maybe possession. Increasingly, she couldn't tell the difference. The messenger returned on the 3rd day. Serafina met him at the gates with Kael at her shoulder and Lord Castor holding her written refusal. "This is Duchess Vale's response," Castor said, handing over the sealed document. The messenger read it quickly. His face went pale. "You're refusing?" "We're refusing," Serafina confirmed. The messenger looked between them. "You understand what this means? Total war, no mercy. The Emperor will destroy everything you've built. Then he better bring enough soldiers." The messenger shook his head slowly. "You're all dead. You just don't know it yet." He rode away. Kael turned toward the assembled group. "All right, War Council, now." They gathered in the great hall where Kael spread maps showing Empire troop positions, supply routes, allied houses willing to support resistance. "We have advantages," he said. "Mountains favor defense. Empire has longer supply lines. Their troops are exhausted from putting down revolts across 3 provinces. If we coordinate properly, we can fracture their forces and make this cost more than Valen can afford." It was good strategy. Almost believable. Almost. Because even with advantage, they were still 43 people against an empire. The council worked through the night, planning ambushes and raids and defensive positions. Everyone contributed. Everyone understood they were designing their own elaborate suicide, but at least they were choosing how to die. Near dawn, a scout burst into the hall. Riders approaching, multiple groups, flying colors from houses Meridian, Corvus, and Ashford. Allies, Lord Castor breathed. The support Kale promised. The fortress gates opened to reveal not 43 people but nearly 300. Minor nobles who had secretly pledged support, merchants with weapons, former soldiers seeking purpose, all arriving to stand against the Empire. Kyle had delivered on his promises. Serafina felt something break and reform inside her chest. They had actual chance now. Not survival necessarily, but chance to make the Empire regret starting this war. She stood on the battlements watching refugees become army, and wondered when she had stopped being Duchess, playing politics, and became revolutionary, willing to burn everything for principles she couldn't compromise. The answer came quietly, the moment she refused to kill Lord Caro. Everything after that had been falling toward this inevitable collision. Kale joined her on the wall. We have 3 days before Imperial forces arrive. Maybe 4 if we're lucky. Then we use every hour. She turned toward him. Thank you. For believing this was possible when I couldn't. Kael's expression softened. You saved me. I'm just returning the favor. He walked away to coordinate defenses. Serafina remained on the battlements, watching an army assemble from nothing, and felt the future shifting around her like storm about to break. Behind her, someone cleared their throat. She turned to find Maris, her old housekeeper, standing with travel pack and expression carved from granite. Maris, what are you doing here? Same thing everyone else is, Your Grace, choosing sides. Serafina felt tears burn her eyes. You should have stayed at the manor, stayed safe. Safe? Maris laughed bitterly. The Empire burned Vale Manor 2 days ago, executed everyone who remained. I escaped through servant passages and rode here. She stepped closer. There is no safe anymore, Your Grace. There's only choosing whether to die on your knees or standing. I raised you, watched you become the woman your mother hoped you'd be, and I'll be damned if I let you face this alone. Serafina pulled the old woman into a hug, feeling Maris's thin shoulders shake with exhaustion and determination. When they separated, Maris was crying. Your mother would be proud, she whispered. She spent her whole life fighting empire that viewed women as decoration. You're finishing what she started. Serafina had never known that, had always thought her mother died young from illness, not from pushing too hard against system designed to break anyone who challenged it. Suddenly, everything made sense. The visions, the prophecy, her own death looming like destiny. She was repeating her mother's pattern, fighting empire until it destroyed her. But unlike her mother, Serafina had Kael, and Kael had promised to burn the world before letting her die. She just hoped the cost wouldn't be worse than the alternative. The Empire arrived at dawn on the 4th day. General Voss brought 5,000 troops, cavalry, archers, siege engines. Overwhelming force designed to crush resistance quickly. They surrounded the fortress and demanded surrender. Serafina stood on the walls with 300 defenders and refused. Voss's response was immediate. Total assault. Siege engines launched projectiles. Archers rained arrows. Infantry advanced with siege ladders and battering rams. The defenders fought with desperate efficiency. Kael had trained them well, positioned them perfectly, created defensive strategy that maximized their limited resources. But 5,000 troops against 300 was mathematics that didn't lie. They held for 6 hours before the walls were breached. Imperial soldiers poured through gaps in stone, while defenders fell back to secondary positions. The fortress became a maze of desperate battles, hand-to-hand combat in corridors, archers firing from windows, wounded screaming in languages pain made universal. Serafina fought alongside everyone else, sword in hand, killing to survive. She had never killed before, had spent her entire life avoiding violence. Now she moved through it like someone born for this. Beside her, Kyle fought like demon-made flesh. His sword never stopped moving. Every strike killed or maimed. He was beautiful and terrible, and exactly what she'd created by teaching Broken Boy that survival required becoming weapon. They retreated through the fortress as positions fell. Secondary defenses. Tertiary fallbacks. Each bought minutes while soldiers died to protect people they'd only known weeks. Finally, They reached the Great Hall, last defensible position. Maybe 30 defenders remained, exhausted, wounded, out of options. Imperial soldiers surrounded them. General Voss entered through shattered doors, immaculate despite battle. He surveyed the carnage with expression carved from ice. "Duchess Vale," he said, "you've cost the Empire dearly. Nearly 200 soldiers dead." "And you've cost us everything," Serafina replied. "Was it worth it?" Voss smiled coldly. "That's not for me to decide. I just follow orders." He gestured. Soldiers moved forward to secure prisoners. That's when the hall's rear wall exploded. Stone and dust filled the air. Through the chaos, new figures emerged, soldiers wearing colors from houses across the empire. Not 300, thousands. The alliance Kael had built hadn't been refugees. It had been coordinated rebellion. General Voss's expression shifted from confidence to calculation as he realized he hadn't crushed resistance. He'd walked into trap. "Retreat," he commanded. Too late. The fortress had been bait. The real battle was happening outside where allied houses had surrounded Voss's forces. 5,000 Imperial troops suddenly surrounded by 8,000 rebels. The Empire's advantage evaporated. Serafina watched through shattered walls as the battle turned. Watched Imperial soldiers realize they were trapped. Watched General Voss understand he'd been outmaneuvered by Duchess he'd underestimated. Kael appeared at her side, covered in blood and dust, and something that looked like savage satisfaction. "Told you we'd make them bleed," he said. The battle lasted until sunset. When it ended, General Voss was captured, 3,000 Imperial soldiers were dead, and the rest had surrendered or fled. The fortress had held. Barely, but held. Serafina walked through halls filled with wounded and dying, helping where she could, closing eyes that wouldn't see morning. She had led these people into war. The least she could do was witness the price. Near midnight, she found Lord Castor slumped against a wall, holding his stomach where blood seeped through fingers. Castor. She knelt beside him. "We need a healer." "Too late," he whispered. "Internal bleeding. Been dying for hours." "No. We didn't come this far." "My wife," Castor interrupted. "Did you know she died 3 days ago? Imperial soldiers executed her. My grandchildren, too. Voss told me personally before the battle. Thought it would break me." Tears streaked through blood on his face. "But it didn't break me. It just gave me reason to fight harder. So when I die knowing I made them pay for every life they took." He coughed, blood bubbling on his lips. "You did something impossible today, Duchess. You beat the Empire. Now you need to do something harder." "What?" "Lead. Not just in battle, in everything that comes after. Because if you don't, someone else will. Someone like Valen. And this all happens again." His eyes closed. Serafina held his hand until he stopped breathing. Then she stood, covered in his blood and surrounded by bodies of people who had believed in her enough to die and felt the weight of responsibility that came with survival. She had won the battle. Now she had to win the war. And something told her the Empire's response would make today look gentle. They buried the dead at sunrise. 147 defenders. No names on graves because there wasn't time. Just stones marking where bodies lay while world continued its relentless turning. Serafina stood before the mass grave with survivors, trying to find words adequate for this moment. There weren't any. "They fought for future they won't see," she said finally. "For world where empire doesn't execute families for defiance. Where nobility means protecting people instead of exploiting them." Her voice carried across silent assembly. "And we owe them completion. Not vengeance. Not more death. But actual change worth dying for." She stepped back. Kael stood beside her, expression unreadable. "You can't stop now. You know that. I know. The Empire will retaliate. Send armies. Destroy everyone connected to this rebellion. I know. And you'll have to become something you hate. Someone who orders deaths, who makes impossible choices, who sacrifices pieces of herself until there's nothing left except person wearing your face." Serafina looked at him. "Is that what you see?" "That's what I see in everyone who survives leadership." Kael's silver eyes reflected morning light. "But it's not what I see in you, yet." "What do you see?" "Someone still trying to believe mercy matters. Someone who thinks you can win without becoming the enemy. He touched her shoulder briefly. Hold on to that, as long as you can. Because once you lose it, there's no getting it back. He walked away to help organize defenses for the reprisal everyone knew was coming. Serafina remained at the graves, surrounded by the dead and the weight of choices that had led here, wondering how long she could maintain principles in war that viewed them as weakness. Not long, she suspected, because the visions were returning, more frequent, more detailed. Always the same scene. Kyle standing over her body, silver eyes filled with grief so profound it looked like madness. She had thought the prophecy meant he would betray her. Now she understood differently. Kyle would never betray her, would never choose anyone over her, would burn kingdoms and slaughter thousands and destroy himself completely if that's what keeping her alive required. That wasn't betrayal. That was devotion so absolute it became catastrophe. And standing among graves of people who died because she'd given them hope, Serafina finally understood what the prophecy meant. She wouldn't die because Kyle betrayed her. She would die trying to stop him from destroying the world in her name. The Empire's retribution came 3 weeks later with an army that blotted out the horizon, 15,000 soldiers, 200 siege engines, cavalry units that could crush stone with coordinated charges. Emperor Valen had committed resources that would bankrupt provinces for decades, all to destroy one Duchess who refused to kneel. Serafina stood on the fortress walls watching death approach in organized columns and wondered if this was how empires always ended, not with philosophical debate, but with overwhelming violence designed to erase alternatives. She had 8,000 defenders now. Houses from across the empire had sent troops after word spread about General Voss's defeat, minor nobles who saw opportunity, merchants protecting investments, common soldiers sick of executing civilians for imperial entertainment. It was almost enough to make this interesting. Almost. Kyle appeared beside her, studying the approaching force with tactical precision that had become second nature. He wore armor now, black steel that made him look like death-given form. The boy who had been so broken was gone completely. In his place stood someone who calculated casualties like mathematics. "They outnumber us 2-1, he said quietly. "I can count. Can you win?" Serafina looked at him. "Does it matter? We fight or we surrender. Those are the options. There's a third option, which is..." Kale's silver eyes met hers with intensity that felt like physical pressure. "We don't fight defensive war. We take the battle to them, strike their command structure, kill Emperor Valen personally, watch the empire collapse without its figurehead. That's assassination. That's strategy." Kale's jaw tightened. "You think Valen wouldn't do the same to you? He already tried. Multiple times. You survived because I stopped it." Serafina felt something cold settle in her chest. How many assassination attempts? 17 over 3 years. Poison, blades, hired killers. I intercepted all of them. Why didn't you tell me? Because you would have tried negotiating, would have believed you could reason with someone actively trying to murder you. He stepped closer. But you can't negotiate with empire built on terror. You can only remove the person wielding it and hope something better grows from the ashes. It was exactly the argument Serafina had been avoiding for months. The logical conclusion to everything they'd built. If the empire wouldn't change through pressure, it had to be destroyed through decapitation. She should reject the idea, should argue that assassination made them terrorists instead of revolutionaries, that principles mattered even when losing. But standing on walls surrounded by thousands of people who had bet their lives on her leadership, Serafina couldn't afford principles that got everyone killed. "How would it work?" she asked. Kael's expression shifted into something predatory. "Valen's command tent will be at the army's center, protected but not impenetrable. Small strike team, 20 people maximum. We hit at night, kill him and his generals, retreat before anyone realizes what happened. And if we fail, then we die trying." Kael's voice carried absolute certainty. "But we take him with us." Serafina studied the approaching army, calculating odds that didn't favor them no matter what choice she made. Defensive war meant slow attrition. Assassination meant gambling everything on single desperate strike. Both options required accepting she had become someone willing to order murders to achieve political goals. The realization should have bothered her more than it did. "Assemble the team," she said finally. "We strike tonight." Kale's eyes flashed with something that looked like triumph or hunger or both. He left immediately to coordinate. Serafina remained on the walls, watching her soul fracture in real time, and wondering if there was functional difference between becoming monster and accepting you always were one. The War Council met in the fortress's command center, where maps covered every surface and exhaustion lived in everyone's eyes. Kale laid out the plan with brutal efficiency. Infiltrate enemy camp during shift change when security was loosest, navigate to command tent using intelligence from captured officers, eliminate Emperor Valen and senior leadership, extract before reinforcements arrived. It was suicide mission with extra steps. Everyone knew it. Everyone volunteered anyway. Serafina selected the team personally. Kael, obviously, Maris, who refused to be left behind, 12 veterans from allied houses who had nothing left to lose. 15 people total against an empire. The mathematics were terrible, but the alternative was slower dying. They prepared through the afternoon. Weapons sharpened, armor checked. Final letters written to families who might never read them. All the small rituals people performed when accepting death was probable. Near sunset, Serafina found Kael in the armory, methodically checking equipment with focus that looked like meditation. "You don't have to come," she said. "This was my decision." Kael looked at her like she'd suggested breathing was optional. "Wherever you go, I go." That's not negotiable. Even to death? Especially to death. He set down the sword he'd been inspecting. "You saved me when I was nothing. Gave me reason to survive when dying seemed easier. Everything I am exists because you decided I was worth the effort." His hands clenched. "So yes, I'll follow you into suicidal assassination attempt. I'll follow you into actual hell if that's where you're going, because the only thing worse than dying is watching you face darkness alone." Serafina felt her throat tighten. "You're not responsible for protecting me from every threat." "Yes, I am." That's what love means. He said it simply. Statement of fact. No drama or poetry, just truth delivered with certainty that made argument impossible. Serafina had spent 3 years trying to teach him healthy attachment, trying to explain that love shouldn't require self-destruction. That caring about someone didn't mean sacrificing everything for their survival. She'd failed completely, and standing in an armory preparing for assassination that would likely kill them both, Serafina realized she didn't want to fix it anymore. Because Kael's devotion was the only thing keeping her alive in a world designed to destroy women who refuse submission. His willingness to become monster meant she didn't have to. His love, toxic and absolute and terrifying, was the only reason she'd survived this long. She was using him, had been from the beginning. The realization tasted like blood. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" "For turning you into a weapon. For teaching you that survival required brutality. For making you believe love meant annihilation." Kael stepped closer, close enough she could see silver eyes reflecting torchlight. "You didn't make me anything. You gave me choice. I chose you. Every day. Every moment. That's not manipulation, that's decision." He touched her face gently, the gesture incongruous with his armor and weapons and the violence they were about to commit. "Stop trying to save me from myself. I'm exactly who I want to be. Then we're both damned." "Probably." Kael smiled, and it was the saddest thing she'd ever seen. "But at least we're damned together." He left to finish preparations. Serafina stood alone, surrounded by instruments of death, understanding finally that prophecy wasn't warning about betrayal. It was warning about the cost of love that refused boundaries. Kael would never betray her, but his devotion would destroy everything she'd tried to build. And tonight, she was going to help him do it. What? They left at midnight through tunnels Kael had discovered during his year of preparation. The passages emerged 2 miles from the fortress, well beyond Imperial picket lines. From there, they moved through darkness toward enemy camp, 15 shadows slipping between patrols with practiced efficiency. Kael led, navigating by instinct and intelligence gathered from interrogated prisoners. Behind him, the strike team followed in absolute silence. These weren't nobles playing war. They were survivors who understood hesitation meant death. The Imperial camp sprawled across valley floor like festering wound, thousands of tents organized in military precision, campfires casting flickering light, soldiers drinking and gambling and preparing for tomorrow's assault. None of them expected attack from within. The team split into 3 groups. Kael and Serafina would target the command tent. Two teams would create diversions at opposite ends of camp. Simple plan, maximum chaos. Serafina checked her weapons one final time. 2 daggers, short sword, poison vial as last resort. She had trained for months but never killed intentionally before General Voss's assault. Tonight, she would assassinate Emperor. The transformation was complete. They moved into camp during guard rotation, slipping between tents while soldiers changed shifts. Kyle navigated like he'd memorized the layout, which he probably had. His preparation bordered on obsessive, but obsession was why they'd survived this long. The command tent loomed ahead, massive structure flying imperial colors surrounded by elite guards who looked competent and alert. Kyle signaled the team to halt. He studied guard patterns for full minute, calculating approach angles. Then the diversions began. Explosions ripped through the eastern camp. Fire erupted in the western supply depot. Alarms rang. Soldiers scrambled. Half the guards protecting the command tent ran toward chaos. "Now," Kyle whispered. They moved as one, crossing open ground in seconds. The remaining guards barely registered threat before Kyle's blade opened throats. Serafina followed, her own knife finding kidney and lung with precision she'd learned from watching him kill. It was efficient, brutal, necessary. They were inside the tent before anyone could raise alarm. Emperor Valen sat at campaign tables surrounded by generals and maps, looking older than Serafina remembered. Illness had carved him hollow, turned skin translucent. He was dying anyway. They were just accelerating the inevitable. Valen looked up as they entered. His expression shifted from surprise to calculation to something that might have been resignation. "Duchess Vale, I should have known you'd try something desperate." "Desperation is all you left us," Serafina said, sword held steady. The generals reached for weapons. Kale killed 3 before they cleared scabbards. The others froze. "Such loyalty," Valen observed, gesturing at Kale. "The boy you saved became your executioner." Poetic. He stood slowly, hands visible and empty. "You think killing me solves anything? The Empire exists beyond one man. There are heirs, successors, systems designed to perpetuate regardless of leadership." "Then we'll dismantle the systems," Serafina said. "With what authority? You're traitor and terrorist, murderer of legitimate emperor. History will remember you as villain. History is written by survivors. Let's see who that is." She moved forward, sword raised for killing stroke. Valen smiled. "Before you commit regicide, perhaps you should ask your devoted shadow why he's really here." Serafina hesitated. "What?" Valen's eyes shifted to Kyle. "Tell her. Tell her what you discovered 3 months ago. What you've been hiding while planning this perfect moment." Kale's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind silver eyes. Something that looked like guilt. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "Don't you?" Valen laughed, the sound wet with dying lungs. "Your family, boy. The Ardens. You thought the Empire massacred them for political convenience, but that's not quite accurate." "Stop talking," Kyle said quietly. "Your father was Imperial Spy Master, one of my most valuable assets, and your mother was noblewoman from House Corvus. Their marriage was arranged to consolidate intelligence networks." Valen stepped closer, despite the weapons aimed at him. "But your father got greedy, started selling secrets to highest bidder, became liability. So yes, I ordered his execution, along with everyone connected to him." He looked at Kyle directly. "Except you, the youngest son, too young to be complicit. I let you live. Had you placed an orphanage where you'd be forgotten." Serafina's blood went cold. "You knew who he was." "Of course I knew." Valen's smile widened. "And I knew what Duchess Vale would do when she saw a broken child at execution cart. Knew she'd save him. Knew she'd raise him. Knew he'd become devoted enough to do anything for her." He turned back to Kyle, including discover his real history, including learn that every tragedy in his life traces back to the woman who saved him. Serafina's world tilted. "That's not true, isn't it?" Valen gestured at documents on the table. "Your father, Duchess, was the magistrate who uncovered Arden Sr.'s treason, who presented evidence, who recommended execution." He let the words sink in. "Without Duke Vale's investigation, the Arden family survives. Young Kyle grows up privileged and loved instead of traumatized and feral. So in very real way, You destroyed his family, then saved him, then raised him to worship you. Valen laughed again. And now he's going to help you murder me, never knowing his devotion is built on foundation of patricide by proxy. Serafina turned toward Kael, her hands shaking. Did you know? Kael's expression was carved from stone. For 3 months. Why didn't you tell me? Because it doesn't matter. It matters to me. Kael finally met her eyes, and Serafina saw oceans of pain behind silver. My father was traitor who endangered the empire for profit. Your father did his duty. That's not your crime. That's not something you're responsible for. His hands clenched around his sword. And even if it was, even if you personally ordered my family's execution, I'd still choose you, because the person who matters isn't the one who destroyed my past. It's the one who gave me future. Valen shook his head. Such beautiful delusion. The boy is so broken he'll forgive patricide if it means keeping his savior. He turned to Serafina. Can you live with that, Duchess? Can you accept devotion bought with blood and trauma? Can you murder me knowing the weapon you're wielding was forged in fire you helped create? Serafina felt reality fracturing around her. Every choice, every decision, every moment of this rebellion traced back to single act of mercy 3 years ago. She'd saved Kael to prevent her prophesied death, and in doing so created exact circumstances that made it inevitable. She'd caused this. All of it. The visions had been warning, and she'd interpreted them as threat instead of consequence. Lower your sword, Valen said. Walk away. Let the empire continue. And maybe, just maybe, you can live with what you've become. Serafina's hands trembled. The blade wavered. Then Kael spoke, his voice cutting through her spiral. He's lying about one thing. Both Valen and Serafina looked at him. My father's investigation wasn't Duke Vale's idea. Kael's eyes burned with cold fire. I found the real documents, the unsealed orders. Valen commanded the investigation, chose Vale as investigator specifically because it would implicate a major house. He stepped forward. You didn't just kill my family. You weaponized their destruction to compromise House Vale, made the Duke complicit in execution so you'd have leverage. And when Duke Vale realized he'd been used, you had him poisoned. Kael's smile was terrible. Duchess Vale's father didn't die from illness. He died because you needed House Vale vulnerable, needed Serafina isolated and controllable. Valen's expression flickered. The boy is creative, I'll give him that. I'm thorough. Kael drew a document from his armor. This is your signature. Ordering Duke Vale's assassination. I found it in General Voss's correspondence. He threw the paper on the table. You killed both our families, then tried to make us believe we were responsible for each other's tragedies. All to maintain control. Serafina felt something break and reform inside her chest. The guilt evaporated, replaced by rage so pure it felt like clarity. Valen had orchestrated everything, every tragedy, every manipulation, every moment of pain that led to this convergence, and he expected her to walk away. No, Serafina said quietly. She raised her sword. Valen's eyes widened. You'd murder dying man to satisfy revenge? This isn't revenge. This is removing cancer before it metastasizes further. She struck. The blade caught Valen in the chest, punching through imperial silk and flesh. He gasped, blood bubbling on lips, eyes wide with shock that someone had actually done it. Serafina twisted the steel. This is for every family you destroyed, every life you broke, every person who died because you viewed power as more important than humanity. Valen collapsed, hands clutching wound uselessly. The remaining generals moved. Kael intercepted, his blade a silver blur. 3 died in seconds. The last dropped his weapon and fled. Serafina stood over Emperor Valen's body, watching life drain from eyes that had terrorized empires, and felt nothing except exhausted relief. It was done. The Emperor was dead. Outside, the camp erupted into chaos as news spread, shouting, running, the sound of empire fracturing in real time. We need to leave, Kael said. Now. Serafina couldn't move. She stood frozen, staring at her hands covered in Emperor's blood, understanding she had just crossed line that separated revolutionary from murderer. Serafina. Kael grabbed her arm. We leave or we die here. She nodded numbly. They ran. The extraction team met them at camp's edge, fighting through soldiers who were trying to understand what happened. Maris had blood on her face, but was alive. The others looked grim but functional. They made it past perimeter just as Imperial forces organized pursuit. The run back to fortress took hours, soldiers chasing them through darkness. 3 team members fell to arrows, 2 more to exhaustion. By the time they reached the tunnels, only 10 remained from original 15. They collapsed inside fortress walls as dawn broke over empire that no longer had emperor. Serafina sat against cold stone, covered in blood and dirt and the weight of what she'd become, and waited for the world to end. Instead, messengers started arriving. First from House Corvus, they were joining the rebellion, then House Meridian, pledging troops and resources, then smaller houses, merchant guilds, military units that had been waiting for sign that empire could be challenged. Within 24 hours, half the empire had declared for House Vale. The other half prepared for civil war. Kael found Serafina on the battlements, watching an empire tear itself apart. "You did it," he said quietly. "You killed a tyrant and gave people alternative. I murdered a dying man and plunged the empire into chaos. Same thing from different angle." Kael leaned against the wall. "What happens now?" Serafina looked at him. This boy she'd saved, who had become man she'd weaponized, who had somehow remained devoted despite learning she'd been adjacent to his family's destruction. "Now we win the war, or we die trying. And after? After we figure out if empire built on ashes can become something worth surviving." Kael studied her face. "You're different. I killed the emperor. That tends to change people." "No. You're different because you stopped pretending you weren't capable of this. Stopped believing mercy and strength were opposites." He touched her shoulder. "You became what the moment required. That's not corruption. That's evolution." "Is it?" Serafina felt tears burning. "Because I look at what I've done, who I've become, and I don't recognize myself anymore." "Good." Kael's silver eyes reflected sunrise. "The woman you were couldn't have survived this, but the woman you are might actually win." He left her alone on the walls. Below, soldiers prepared defenses. Above, birds circled carrion that would feed them for weeks. And somewhere in the distance, Imperial loyalists organized forces that would either crush this rebellion or die trying. Serafina watched the empire fracture and understood prophecy had been correct. She was going to die. Not because Kael would kill her, but because the woman she'd been couldn't survive what came next. That Duchess was already dead, murdered by necessity and crowned in blood. The question wasn't whether she'd survive. It was whether the person wearing her face when this ended would be recognizable as human, or just another tyrant with better rhetoric. The civil war lasted 6 months and killed hundreds of thousands. Imperial loyalists rallied around Valen's nephew, a weak man who inherited crown without authority to wield it. He commanded armies through inherited legitimacy, while Serafina built coalition through demonstrated competence. It should have been contest. It wasn't. Battle after battle, the rebellion won. Not through superior numbers, but through coordination and strategy and leadership that understood you couldn't ask people to die for because you wouldn't die for yourself. Serafina led from front lines, fought in every major engagement, bled with soldiers who followed her into hell because she proved she'd walk beside them. Kael remained at her side, her shadow and sword, and the only constant in the world that kept trying to destroy her. They pushed toward the capital through winter that killed as effectively as combat. Armies froze, supplies dwindled, soldiers died from exposure and starvation, and diseases that thrived in cramped conditions. But they kept moving, because stopping meant dying slower. Finally, on the first day of spring, they reached the imperial capital's walls. The city was preparing for siege. Civilians evacuated, defenses reinforced, supplies stockpiled for months-long resistance. The acting emperor had retreated behind walls that had never fallen in 600 years of imperial history. Serafina stood before gates that had witnessed empires rise and fall, commanding an army of 80,000 soldiers who had fought their way across frozen landscape to stand at this moment. Kael appeared beside her, armor dented and scarred from 6 months of constant warfare. "Final battle," he said. "Final battle," Serafina agreed. "Are you ready?" She looked at him, this boy who had become man, who had become something beyond category, weapon and lover and devoted guardian, whose love had destroyed kingdoms. I'm terrified. Good. Kael's smile was gentle. Means you're still human. Barely. Close enough. He touched her hand briefly, the gesture intimate despite armor and weapons and 80,000 witnesses. Whatever happens in there, I'm with you. Until the end. Serafina squeezed his fingers. I know. She turned toward the army, toward soldiers who had followed her through hell, and raised her voice so it carried across assembled thousands. This is it. Final assault. We take the capital today, or we die trying. She paused, letting words sink in. The empire you're fighting was built on conquest and maintained through terror. It views you as disposable, resources to extract and discard. But you are not disposable. You are the people who refused submission, who chose uncertain death over certain slavery. Her voice strengthened. So yes, many of us will die today, but we'll die proving the empire can't break everyone who challenges it. We'll die building foundation for something better. She drew her sword. And when historians write about this moment, they'll remember we didn't just destroy tyranny. We created alternative. The army roared approval. Siege engines moved into position. Archers prepared. Infantry formed ranks. Kael coordinated the assault with brutal efficiency. 6 months of warfare had refined him into something beyond human. He moved through battlefield like death made manifest, his presence alone breaking enemy moral. The assault began at noon. Siege engines launched projectiles that shattered wall sections. Archers provided covering fire. Infantry advanced with ladders and battering rams. The capital's defenses responded with trained discipline. Boiling oil, arrows, stones dropped from walls. Soldiers died in dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. But the assault continued, because this was everything, final moment, last chance to prove empires could fall. Serafina fought alongside infantry, sword red with blood, armor dented from impacts. She killed soldiers defending system that had tried to destroy her, killed to survive, killed to win, killed because that's what revolution required. Beside her, Kael moved like storm given form. His blade never stopped. Every strike killed or maimed. He had transcended combat into art form where death was medium. They breached the walls at sunset. Imperial defenders fell back to secondary positions as rebel forces poured through gaps in ancient stone. The city became a maze of brutal close-quarters combat, street fighting, building clearances, desperate last stands by loyalists who knew surrender meant execution. The fighting continued through the night. By dawn, rebel forces controlled 3/4 of the capital. The acting emperor had retreated to the palace, surrounded by final defenders and facing inevitable defeat. Serafina stood in the city square where she'd once watched executions, covered in blood and exhaustion and the weight of 60,000 dead soldiers, and prepared for final confrontation. The palace loomed ahead, symbol of imperial power that had endured centuries. Now it would fall. Kael organized the assault with Maris coordinating logistics. The old housekeeper had survived 6 months of warfare through sheer stubborn refusal to die. She looked ancient but unbreakable. Final push, she said. One more battle. One more, Serafina agreed. Then what? Then we figure out if revolution was worth the price. Maris touched her arm. Your mother would be proud. She fought this same war in different way. You finished what she started, at cost of 100,000 lives. Revolutions are expensive. Maris's eyes were sad but certain. But slavery costs more. Just slower. You chose fast pain over slow dying. Is that enough? Has to be, because we're already committed. The assault began with artillery bombardment that shattered palace defenses. Then infantry advanced through smoke and chaos, fighting through loyalist soldiers who knew this was their last stand. Serafina and Kael led the charge, moving through palace corridors where emperors had walked for generations. The building bled defenders. Every room was battlefield, every corridor kill zone. They reached the throne room at midday. The acting emperor sat on throne surrounded by final guards, looking pathetic and terrified and so very young. He couldn't have been older than 20, thrust into role he never wanted by Uncle's assassination. Surrender, Serafina commanded. It's over. The young emperor looked at her with eyes that understood he was dead regardless of choice. If I surrender, you'll execute me anyway. Not execution, trial. Let history judge your crimes. History is written by victors. The emperor stood. You'll make me monster to justify your revolution. He drew his sword. But I won't die begging. I'll die fighting. At least that's something. He attacked. The guards followed. It was brief and brutal. Kael killed 4 guards in seconds. The others fell to rebel soldiers. The acting emperor fought with desperate courage of someone who knew death was certain. Serafina could have let soldiers finish it, could have avoided becoming executioner again. Instead, she stepped forward and took his life personally, because leaders who ordered deaths should have courage to deliver them. The young emperor fell across throne that had seated conquerors and tyrants and now served as deathbed for final heir. The empire died with him. Silence-filled throne room broken only by breathing and blood dripping on marble. Serafina stood over the body, feeling nothing except exhausted completion. It's done, Kael said quietly. Yes. What now? Serafina looked around throne room, filled with dead and dying, at city beyond that burned with revolution's fires, at empire that had fractured beyond repair. Now we build something better, or we become exactly what we destroyed. Kael's expression was unreadable. And which do you think happens? Before Serafina could answer, Maris burst into throne room. Your Grace. We have a situation. What kind of situation? The kind where rebel commanders are fighting over who controls what territory, houses claiming credit for victory, generals demanding positions, everyone positioning for power while city burns. Maris's face was grim. You killed Emperor and broke the empire. Now everyone wants to be next tyrant. Serafina felt prophecy clicking into place with terrible clarity. This was the moment. The future she'd been running from. Not death in battle, but death by choice. Because someone had to lead. Had to consolidate fractured rebellion into functional government before it devolved into warlordism. And the only person positioned to do that was her. The woman who'd murdered 2 emperors and conquered capital. The woman everyone would follow out of fear or loyalty or opportunism. She could build new empire. Better one. Rule with principles she'd fought for. Or she could refuse. Let chaos reign. Watch everything they died for fracture into petty kingdoms ruled by whoever was most ruthless. Both options required sacrifice. Both led to the same ending. Take me to them, Serafina said. She walked through palace corridors toward throne room where commanders fought over corpse of empire, and understood finally what prophecy had been showing her. Not betrayal, not murder, but choice. The choice between becoming savior or tyrant. Between revolution and just another empire with better marketing. And standing at the throne where emperors had ruled, surrounded by people demanding she seize power, Serafina saw Kael watching her with silver eyes that held absolute devotion and absolute danger. Because he would support whatever she chose, would enforce her rule with terrifying efficiency, would help her become exactly the monster they'd fought against, if that's what keeping her alive required. The prophecy wasn't about Kael killing her. It was about her having to stop him before his love destroyed everything they'd built. Serafina opened her mouth to speak, to make the choice that would define everything that came after, to finally answer the question that had haunted her since the moment she saved a broken boy from execution. And the throne room doors exploded inward. The explosion threw Serafina across the throne room. She hit marble hard enough to crack ribs, vision swimming with stars and smoke. Her ears rang with the kind of silence that comes after violence, that hollow space where the world resets itself around new reality. Through dust and chaos, figures emerged from the shattered doorway. Not imperial loyalists, not reinforcements, common soldiers, hundreds of them. Veterans from the siege wearing mismatched armor and carrying weapons that had seen too much use. They filled the throne room like flood, surrounding the commanders who had been fighting over territory. At their front stood a woman Serafina recognized, Captain Yara Thorne, a former Imperial officer who had defected 6 months ago with her entire unit. She was maybe 40, scarred from decades of warfare, with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall, and learned not to trust either. She looked at Serafina with expression carved from granite. We need to talk, Duchess. Kael moved immediately, sword drawn, positioning himself between Serafina and potential threat. His soldiers followed, creating defensive formation that would buy seconds at best against overwhelming numbers. Stand down, Yara commanded her troops. We're not here for violence. Then what are you here for? Serafina asked, pulling herself upright despite ribs that screamed protest. Answers. Yara stepped forward carefully. We just spent 6 months bleeding for revolution, watched 60,000 soldiers die to destroy tyranny. And now we're hearing commanders fight over who gets which territory, who controls trade routes, who gets appointed governor. She gestured at the assembled leadership. Sounds a lot like Empire with different faces. The throne room went silent. Serafina felt weight of 800 eyes watching her response. This was the moment. The choice between honesty that might fracture everything or comforting lies that would preserve power. She chose truth. You're right. We destroyed one empire and commanders are already building another. Different names, same structure. Because that's what power does. It corrupts intention until revolution becomes just another conquest. The commanders exploded into protest. Yara's soldiers tensed. Kael's grip tightened on his sword. But Serafina continued, voice cutting through chaos. Which is why I'm not taking the throne. Silence crashed down like physical force. What? Lord Ashford demanded. You can't just walk away. Someone needs to lead. Then elect someone. Hold vote. Create council. Build government that represents people instead of whoever's most effective at killing. Serafina looked around throne room at commanders who had followed her through hell. I murdered 2 emperors, killed thousands, burned half an empire to prove tyranny could be challenged. But if I take this throne, all I've done is prove violence is path to power. That strongest killer wins. She walked toward the throne, each step sending pain through cracked ribs. So no, I won't rule. Won't become next tyrant wearing revolutionary rhetoric. The empire ends here. What comes next needs to be built by people who weren't forged in 6 months of slaughter. Lord Meridian stepped forward. You'd abandon us? After everything we sacrificed, I'd give you a chance to build something better than monarchy dressed as revolution. Serafina met his eyes. You want me to lead? Fine. I'll lead by demonstrating power can be surrendered instead of hoarded until death. She turned toward Yara. Captain Thorne, you commanded soldiers who fought for principles instead of profit. Who believed revolution meant actual change? I'm proposing provisional government led by military veterans and civilian representatives. Elections within 1 year. No hereditary positions. No lifetime appointments. Yara's eyes narrowed. You're serious. Completely. And what do you get out of this? To not become the monster I fought against. Serafina looked at Kael, who stood frozen, calculating implications. I saved a boy 3 years ago because I thought mercy mattered. Built rebellion because I thought tyranny could be challenged. Now I'm proving change doesn't require replacing one dictator with another. The room erupted into argument. Commanders demanding she reconsider. Soldiers supporting provisional government. Everyone talking over each other while Empire's corpse cooled on the floor. Kael remained silent, silver eyes burning with something Serafina couldn't read. Finally, Yara raised her hand for silence. I support Duchess Vale's proposal. Provisional government. Elections. Actual representation. Anyone who objects can take it up with several hundred veterans who are sick of dying for other people's power fantasies. Her soldiers roared agreement. The commanders looked between armed veterans and their own ambitions, calculating odds. Slowly, grudgingly, they nodded acceptance. Because arguing meant civil war they'd probably lose. Serafina felt something break inside her chest. Relief or grief or exhaustion so profound it felt like dying while remaining vertical. She had done it. Destroyed empire and refused crown. Proved revolution could mean actual change instead of just redistribution of tyranny. The cost had been everything she was, but maybe that was the point. Maybe real change required destroying not just systems, but the people who perpetuated them, even when that person was yourself. The provisional government formed over the next 3 days. Captain Yara Thorne was elected military representative by veteran vote. Civilian councils formed from merchant guilds and surviving noble houses willing to accept democracy. Maris was appointed to oversee transition logistics because the old housekeeper had somehow become indispensable to keeping anything functional. Serafina attended meetings but didn't lead them, offered advice when asked but didn't command. The transition was messy and contentious and probably destined for problems, but it was happening without requiring another war. That felt like victory. Sort of. She found Kael on the palace battlements 3 days after the throne room confrontation. He stood watching the capital rebuild, his armor abandoned for simple clothes that made him look almost human. Almost. "You've been avoiding me," Serafina said. "Processing." "Processing what?" "Everything you just gave up." Kyle turned toward her. "You won. You had throne, loyalty, power to rebuild empire according to your vision, and you walked away, because taking it would have made me Valen." "No." Kale's voice was soft. "It would have made you different kind of ruler. Someone who cared about people instead of viewing them as resources. Until caring wasn't enough. Until maintaining power required compromises that transformed good intentions into atrocity." Serafina leaned against the wall. "I watched my father spend 20 years trying to reform empire from within. Watched it corrupt him piece by piece until he was enforcing same tyranny he'd sworn to change. Power does that. Turns revolutionaries into tyrants who believe the end justifies means. So you're breaking the cycle. Trying to." Silence stretched between them, comfortable despite weight of everything left unsaid. Finally, Kyle spoke. "What happens to us?" Serafina felt her heart constrict. "What do you want to happen?" Kale's silver eyes met hers with intensity that felt like drowning. "I want what I've always wanted, to stay beside you, protect you, make sure the world that tried to destroy us both fails forever." His hands clenched. "But I'm starting to understand that's not healthy. That my devotion is weapon we've been using to survive, but survival's over now. And I don't know how to exist without that purpose. You exist by living, by finding meaning that isn't defined by me. I don't know how. Then we figure it out together." Serafina touched his face gently. "You saved me as much as I saved you, became my sword when I needed violence, my shield when I needed protection. But wars end, Kyle, and soldiers who only know warfare don't survive peace intact. So what? We just separate? No. We learn who we are when we're not fighting, when devotion doesn't require sacrifice." Kyle leaned into her palm like man dying of thirst offered water. "I'm not sure I know how to love you without destroying myself for it." "Then that's what we work on." Serafina pulled him close, feeling him tremble against her. "You were child when I found you, became man in middle of revolution. Now you get to become whoever you want when no one's trying to kill us. That's not abandonment, that's graduation." Kale's laugh was wet with tears he'd been holding for months. "You make it sound simple. It's not. It's probably the hardest thing either of us will do, but we survived civil war. We can survive peace. Can we? Have to. Because the alternative is becoming people who only exist in context of violence. And I refuse to let Valen win posthumously by making us so damaged we can't function without war." They stood together on battlements overlooking city that had witnessed empires rise and fall and tried to imagine future that didn't require constant survival. It felt impossible, but so had everything else they'd accomplished. What? The vision stopped a week after Serafina refused the throne. She woke one morning and realized she hadn't seen her death in days. The prophecy that had haunted her for 3 years had simply vanished, as if it had never been real. Or as if the future she'd been running from had been prevented by choices she couldn't have anticipated. She found Maris in the provisional government offices, managing logistics with same efficient ruthlessness she'd once applied to household management. "The visions are gone," Serafina said without preamble. Maris looked up from documents. "The prophecy?" "Yes." "Good." Maris returned to paperwork. "Prophecies are usually self-fulfilling anyway. You spend so much time trying to prevent them, you create exact circumstances that make them happen. So I was running from future I was creating. Or the prophecy was warning about choice, not destination. Maybe you were always supposed to reach point where Kael's devotion became dangerous. The question was whether you'd recognize it and change course or let it consume you both." Serafina sat heavily. "I almost chose wrong, but you didn't." Maris's smile was tired but genuine. "You chose principles over power, chose demonstrating change over becoming tyrant. Your mother would be proud. Would she? I murdered 2 emperors and killed 60,000 people. Your mother tried to reform the empire through diplomacy. Spent 20 years negotiating and compromising and watching every advance get rolled back by entrenched power. You did in 6 months what she couldn't do in lifetime. Maris's eyes were wet. She died believing change was impossible. That tyranny was too strong. You proved her wrong. Yes, the cost was terrible, but slavery costs more, just slower and harder to see. Serafina felt tears burning. I don't feel like hero. Heroes are propaganda. You're just a person who made hard choices and lived with consequences. That's not heroism. That's being human in a world that punishes humanity. Maris stood, smoothing her apron in gesture unchanged by revolution. Now you get to do harder work, living with what you've done, helping others heal, building something worth the price you paid. She left Serafina alone with documents detailing reconstruction costs and casualty reports, and all the mundane horror of aftermath. Serafina read them until words blurred, trying to reconcile the woman she'd been with woman she'd become, wondering if there was functional difference or if transformation was just slow dying by degrees. Elections happened 6 months later. The provisional government organized voting across territory that had once been empire. It was chaotic and imperfect, and probably fraudulent in a dozen places, but it happened. Common people choosing representatives instead of having leadership imposed through violence. Serafina voted in her home district, alongside farmers and merchants and veterans who had fought in revolution. Nobody recognized her at first. She'd cut her hair short and wore simple clothes, another civilian participating in process she'd helped create. Then someone noticed her scars, the way she moved, silver eyes watching from across the polling station. Word spread quickly. By the time Serafina finished voting, a crowd had gathered. Not threatening, just present. People who wanted to see the woman who had killed emperors and refused throne. She expected anger, accusations, demands for the power she'd surrendered. Instead, an old woman stepped forward. My grandson died in the siege, she said quietly. He was 17. Believed your rebellion would create better world. Serafina's throat closed. I'm sorry, I know that doesn't... Did it? The woman interrupted. Did it create better world? Serafina looked around at polling station where commoners voted for representation, at city rebuilding without slave labor, at future uncertain but possible. I hope so. The old woman nodded slowly. Then he didn't die for nothing. She walked away. Others approached, some thanking Serafina, some cursing her, most just wanting acknowledgement that their sacrifices had mattered. Serafina stood for hours, listening to stories of people who had survived revolution and were trying to figure out what came next. She didn't have answers, didn't have comfort to offer beyond presence and willingness to witness. But maybe that was enough. Maybe being seen was its own form of healing. Kyle found her as the polling station closed, his expression concerned. You've been here all day. People wanted to talk. About what? Everything. Loss. Hope. Whether revolution was worth the cost. Serafina looked at him. I don't think we get to decide if it was worth it. The people who died do, and they can't tell us. So we live with uncertainty. We live with responsibility to make their deaths mean something. They walked through a city that was learning to breathe without empire crushing it, and tried to imagine futures that didn't require constant fighting. The election results came in 3 days later. Captain Yara Thorne won military representative position by overwhelming margin. Civilian councils were split between reformers and traditionalists, which probably meant actual debate instead of rubber-stamping dictates. No single person controlled government. It was messy and contentious and absolutely beautiful. Serafina watched the announcement from house she'd purchased in Capital's merchant district. Small place. Modest. Nothing like Vale Manor, which had burned during the Civil War. She didn't miss it. Wealth had always felt like weight. Now, living simply in an anonymous house, Serafina felt lighter than she had in years. Kyle lived 3 streets over, close enough to visit but distant enough to establish independence. He worked with veteran rehabilitation programs, helping soldiers transition from warfare to peace. The irony of man who had been weapon teaching others to not be weapons wasn't lost on either of them. But it was working, slowly, imperfectly. But working. They met for dinner once a week, meals filled with conversation that didn't revolve around survival or strategy. They talked about books, weather, plans for gardens they might plant, mundane things that felt revolutionary after years of constant crisis. Tonight they sat in Serafina's small kitchen, eating stew Maris had taught Kael to make before she'd retired to countryside villa. "You seem different," Kael observed. "Lighter. I murdered 2 emperors and walked away from power. That tends to lighten your load. Is it enough?" Serafina considered the question. She still had nightmares, still woke screaming from visions of battles and executions and all the people who had died following her leadership. But she also had mornings, coffee, gardens, conversations that didn't require calculating casualties. "It has to be enough," she said finally, "because I can't undo what happened. Can't bring back the dead. Can only try to build future worth their sacrifice." Kael nodded slowly. "I think about that a lot. All the people I killed, whether their deaths brought anything meaningful. Did they? I don't know yet. Ask me in 50 years. Serafina smiled despite herself. "Deal." They finished dinner in comfortable silence. Afterward, as Kael prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Do you ever regret it? Saving me?" Serafina felt her breath catch. The question she'd been avoiding for 3 years, delivered with brutal honesty only Kael possessed. She thought about Broken Boy at execution cart, about monster he'd become, about devotion that had nearly destroyed them both, about the fact that without him, she'd be dead 12 times over. "No," she said, "I don't regret saving you. I regret weaponizing you. Teaching you survival required brutality, making you believe love meant sacrifice. But saving you? Seeing you become person who helps veterans heal instead of weapon that only knows destruction?" Her eyes were wet. "That I'll never regret." Kael's smile was small but genuine. "Good. Because you saved my life, and I'm finally learning how to live it." He left. Serafina stood in doorway watching him disappear into city night and felt prophecy's weight finally lift completely. She had seen her death at his hands for 3 years, but she'd misunderstood what it meant. The death wasn't physical, it was transformation. The woman who had been Duchess playing games died the moment she refused to kill Lord Caro. Everything after had been corpse learning to walk. And now, standing in modest house and city she'd helped liberate, Serafina finally understood what prophecy had been teaching her. Death wasn't ending. It was graduation into whoever you became when you stopped being afraid. 5 years passed. The provisional government became permanent through constitutional convention that created representative democracy with checks preventing single-person rule. It was imperfect, corrupt in places, prone to gridlock and infighting, but it was government of people instead of emperors. Serafina watched from distance, offering consultation when requested but never seeking office. She'd become historian of sorts, documenting revolution's reality to prevent mythology from replacing truth. Someone needed to remember the cost, the bodies, the compromises, the moments where principles fractured against necessity. Because sanitized history created conditions for repetition, Kael continued veteran work, eventually founding network of rehabilitation centers across former empire. He never fully shed the violence that defined him, but he channeled it into protecting others instead of enabling Serafina's crusade. They remained close, not romantic, not quite familial, something undefined that worked because neither tried to label it. Maris died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by gardens she'd cultivated in retirement. Her funeral was attended by thousands, servants she'd trained, soldiers she'd fed, everyone who had witnessed her transform from housekeeper to logistical genius who kept rebellion functioning. Serafina delivered eulogy, talking about woman who had raised her after her mother died, who had followed her into war despite having every reason to stay safe, who had demonstrated that courage existed in choosing to care when caring was dangerous. Afterward, sorting through Maris's belongings, Serafina found letters, hundreds of them. Correspondence between Maris and Serafina's mother, documenting years of attempted reform and increasing frustration with empire that punished progress. The final letter, written days before the Duchess's death, contained a single sentence that broke Serafina's heart. "I failed to change the empire. Perhaps my daughter will be braver than I was." Serafina sat in an empty house holding letter written by mother she barely remembered, and understood finally why prophecy had chosen her. Not because she was special, but because someone had to complete work previous generation couldn't finish. Change was inheritance. Legacy passed through blood and determination until someone finally succeeded. or died trying. She had done both. Died as Duchess playing games, been reborn as woman who understood power's corruption, completed her mother's work at cost of 60,000 lives in her own innocence. It was enough. It had to be enough. Because dwelling on cost without acknowledging achievement meant their deaths were meaningless, and Serafina refused to dishonor them that way.
This said that
10 years after the empire fell, Serafina received invitation to speak at memorial dedication. The monument honored revolution's dead, massive stone structure listing every name recovered from battlefields and mass graves. 60,000 names, maybe more. Record-keeping during war was imperfect. Serafina almost declined. She avoided public appearances, preferring quiet work documenting history. But Kael convinced her. They need to see you, he said. Need to know the person who led them hasn't forgotten. I haven't forgotten. I live with ghosts every day. Then share that. Let them know leadership doesn't mean being untouchable. It means bearing weight together. So Serafina went. The memorial stood in Capital's central square, where executions used to occur. Now the space hosted markets and festivals and normal life of city that had learned to breathe freely. Thousands attended dedication. Veterans, families of the dead, civilians who had survived revolution and wanted to mark its significance. Serafina stood before them feeling ancient despite being only 42. War-aged people in ways time couldn't measure. She had prepared speech, something dignified about sacrifice and meaning and all the comfortable lies people told to make death bearable. She abandoned it. Instead, she spoke truth. 60,000 people died in the revolution. Probably more. We'll never know exact number because war destroys record-keeping along with everything else. Her voice carried across silent crowd. They died because I led them into battles against empire with overwhelming advantage. They died because I couldn't find peaceful solution. They died because I chose violence over diplomacy. And every single day I live with question of whether their deaths bought anything worth the price. She gestured at the city around them. Look at what we built. Representative government, rights for common people. Justice system that doesn't depend on inherited privilege. It's imperfect, corrupt in places, prone to failure. But it's ours. Built by people instead of imposed by emperors. Her eyes were wet. So was it worth it? I don't know. I can't answer that. Only the dead can, and they're not here to tell us. What I can say is this. We owe them completion. We owe them government worth dying for. We owe them vigilance against power that always seeks to consolidate and corrupt. We owe them refusal to let their sacrifice become justification for new tyranny. She paused. And we owe them honesty. About cost. About mistakes. About moments where revolution's principles fractured against reality's brutality. Because sanitized history teaches nothing except that violence is glorious. And violence is never glorious. It's necessary sometimes, unavoidable sometimes, but never glorious. Serafina looked at memorial covered in names of people who had trusted her leadership. They were braver than me, more principled, more deserving of survival. And they're gone because I led them into war. So every day I wake up and try to deserve their sacrifice. Try to build future worth 60,000 deaths. Try to remember that power corrupts and vigilance is price of freedom. And some days I succeed, some days I fail. But I keep trying, because that's what we owe them. Not perfection, just honest effort to be worthy of what they gave. She stepped back. Silence held for a long moment. Then applause. Not triumphant, but acknowledging. The sound of people recognizing shared grief and shared responsibility. Afterward, veterans approached. Some thanked her, some cursed her. Most just wanted moment of connection with woman who had led them through hell. Serafina gave them what she could, presence, acknowledgement, willingness to witness their pain without trying to fix it. Kael found her as sunset, sitting alone beside memorial. Good speech. Honest speech, Serafina corrected. Not sure that's the same thing. It is when most leaders lie about cost. She looked at him, this man who had been broken boy, who had become devoted weapon, who had finally learned to be human. Do you ever regret it, following me? Every day. Kael sat beside her. I regret the people I killed, the violence I normalized, the way I made you complicit in brutality you'd have avoided if I'd been weaker. But I don't regret surviving. Don't regret helping others survive. Don't regret learning that love doesn't require self-destruction. He touched her hand. You taught me mercy when I'd forgotten humans could be kind. Then you taught me violence when survival required it. Then you taught me to set down weapons when war ended. Most people only learn one lesson. You gave me 3. Serafina squeezed his fingers. We gave each other 3. I couldn't have survived without you. Wouldn't have had courage to refuse throne without your devotion, proving love didn't require rulership. So we're both damaged and saved by each other. Probably. Kyle smiled. But we're alive, and the world's better than when we found it. That's something. It's everything. They sat together as stars emerged over city that had witnessed empires rise and fall and rise again as something new, and understood finally that survival wasn't victory, it was opportunity. Chance to build, to heal, to demonstrate that power could be wielded and surrendered. That revolution could mean actual change instead of just redistribution of tyranny. The prophecy had been right all along. Serafina had died. The Duchess who saved Broken Boy died when she refused to become empress. But the woman who emerged from that death was someone who understood that real strength wasn't holding power. It was knowing when to let go. Serafina died at 68, peacefully in sleep. She had lived long enough to see democracy stabilize, to watch Kael become leader in veteran community, teaching others that healing was possible, to witness former empire transform into confederation of states that governed themselves instead of being ruled. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Her funeral was attended by thousands. Current government officials, veterans, common people who remembered revolution, and women who had led it. Kyle delivered eulogy, his silver eyes wet with grief that would never fully fade. Serafina Vale saved me when I was nothing, he said. She saved empire when tyranny seemed unstoppable. She saved us all by demonstrating that power could be challenged and surrendered. His voice cracked. She wasn't perfect. She killed to survive. Compromised principles when necessity demanded it. Made mistakes that cost thousands of lives. But she was human. And her humanity in a world that punished it was bravest thing I've ever witnessed. He looked at assembled mourners. She wanted me to tell you this. Revolutions are never finished. Each generation inherits work of building justice, of resisting power's corruption, of choosing principles over convenience. You inherit that work now. Don't waste it. Don't let her death mean end of vigilance. Because empire always wants to return. Tyranny always seeks foothold. And only constant effort prevents regression. Kael placed single flower on casket. She saved me. She saved you. Now we honor her by continuing work she died completing. They buried Serafina in Memorial Garden beside 60,000 names of people who had died in revolutions she led. No special marker, no elaborate monument, just stone bearing her name and dates and single lines she had written for her own epitaph. She tried. It was enough. Because trying, honestly, and with full acknowledgement of cost, was all anyone could do. The rest was history's judgment. And history, written by survivors who remembered truth instead of mythology, judged her kindly. Not as hero, not as savior, not as flawless revolutionary, but as human who had made hard choices and lived with consequences and demonstrated that change was possible even when cost was everything. Kael lived another 15 years, continuing work with veterans and occasionally speaking about women who had saved him and empire she'd helped destroy. He died surrounded by people he'd helped heal, his final words barely audible. I kept the promise. I stayed with her until the end. And he had. Not physically present at her death, but spiritually beside her through every choice, every battle, every moment of doubt and triumph. Their graves sat side by side in Memorial Garden, and historians would debate for centuries what their relationship had been. Lovers, family, something undefined? The truth was simpler and more complicated than categories allowed. They had been two broken people who saved each other and destroyed empire and learned to set down weapons when war ended. They had been survivors in a world designed to kill them. They had been human in empire that punished humanity. And they had proven that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse power everyone expects you to take. That mercy matters even when it's expensive. That love doesn't require destruction. That change is possible. and that real strength isn't holding throne, it's walking away from one. The empire remembered them as revolutionaries who killed tyrants, but the people who actually knew them remembered something simpler. Two humans who tried to be better than world demanded, who succeeded sometimes and failed often, and who demonstrated that trying honestly and completely was enough. And in the end, that's all any of us get: the chance to try, the courage to fail, the wisdom to know when trying means letting go. Serafina and Kael gave each other that gift, and in doing so, they gave it to everyone else. The empire fell, democracy rose, and two broken people who had saved each other finally found peace, not in victory, not in power, but in having tried with everything they had to leave the world better than they found it. It was enough. It had always been enough. And as generations passed and their names became history instead of memory, the lesson remained. Real revolution isn't destroying tyrants, it's refusing to become one, even when the entire world expects you to wear the crown.